Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe as it is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which city you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. I met a skinwalker in Blackwood Forest. I've always loved solo camping. The isolation of Blackwood Forest has always offered a perfect escape from the relentless grind of city life. My name is Jake, and solitude is where I find my peace. My job in finance is demanding, and the constant pressure and deadlines leave me yearning for these wilderness retreats. Every few months, I pack up my gear and head into the forest, which has always felt like a second home. Until this trip, I had never experienced anything unusual in those woods, but this time something felt different. From the moment I arrived, the forest seemed darker, more oppressive. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their gnarled branches casting sinister shadows. Despite this, I brushed off the unease and set up camp, determined to enjoy my weekend retreat. By dusk, I had my tent pitched in a small clearing and was gathering wood for the fire. The process was almost meditative, a familiar routine that usually helped ground me. As twilight deepened, the forest came alive with the sounds of nature settling in. The first stars appeared, their distant twinkle stark against the enveloping darkness. The fire crackled to life, its warm glow offering a small measure of comfort. I settled into my chair with a beer, trying to relax and embrace the tranquility. But tonight, the usual sounds of the forest, the chirping crickets, rustling leaves, felt more menacing than soothing. It was as if the forest had a heartbeat, each noise echoing unsettlingly close. The vibrant rustle of leaves seemed to carry a darker undertone, and even the crackle of the fire sounded hollow. I tried to lose myself in a book, but the growing darkness seemed to seep into my thoughts. Every gust of wind and snap of a twig kept me on edge. I checked my watch repeatedly, the minutes dragging as night deepened. The shadows grew longer, creeping up on the edges of my firelight, and the once comforting flicker of the flames began to feel inadequate against the encroaching darkness. As the night wore on, the noises grew stranger and more unnerving. The crickets' chorus faded into silence. The wind died down, and the rustling leaves ceased. The usual nighttime symphony was replaced by a suffocating silence. An oppressive stillness settled over the area, amplifying every creak and groan of the woods. The silence felt heavy, almost like it was pressing in from all sides. Then a low, guttural growl pierced the darkness. It seemed to vibrate through the ground, resonating deep within my chest. My heart pounded, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I scanned the darkness beyond the firelight, trying to locate the source. What was that? I muttered, barely above a whisper. My voice felt strange in the silence, almost like an intruder. I grabbed my flashlight and directed its beam into the darkness. The light fell on something, a shape just beyond the fire's edge. At first, it looked like a deer, partially obscured by shadows, but as I squinted, I saw its eyes. They glowed an unnatural red, piercing through the darkness with a malevolent gleam. A chill crept up my spine. "Hello," I called out, hoping for a rational explanation. The creature remained still. Then it let out a scream, an unearthly wail that defied explanation. It started as a deep, resonant cry, like someone in immense pain, and then morphed into a high-pitched shriek that echoed through the forest like a banshee's lament. The sound felt like it was tearing through my sanity, growing louder and more distorted the more I struggled to comprehend it. It was as if the scream was feeding off my fear, intensifying with each passing moment. I stumbled back, dropping my flashlight. The beam flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. I fumbled with my tense zipper, my hands shaking uncontrollably. Inside the tent, I tried to calm myself, but my heart pounded so hard I could barely breathe. I grabbed my hunting knife, trying to reassure myself that I was safe. But the forest had other plans. The minutes stretched into hours, and every rustle of leaves or snap of a twig outside made me jump. I tried to stay awake, my eyes darting around the dark interior of the tent, but exhaustion began to take its toll. I dozed off, only to be jolted awake by a sound that made my blood run cold. That same guttural growl, now much closer. My heart raced as I held my breath, straining to listen. Something was moving outside my tent, circling it slowly. The sound of its footsteps was heavy, deliberate. Then I heard a voice eerily like my own, but twisted and distorted. Jake, ... Come out and play ... I froze, unable to comprehend how it knew my name. The voice continued, repeating my name in a way that was both familiar and horrifyingly wrong. It sounded like someone was mimicking me, but couldn't get it quite right, each repetition more garbled and unsettling than the last. Summoning all my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The fire had long since burned down to embers, casting eerie shadows on the trees. My flashlight lay where I'd dropped it, its beam flickering weakly, and then I saw it. The creature stood at the edge of the clearing, its form shifting and contorting. One moment it looked like a deer, the next it resembled a monstrous version of a human, its limbs elongated and twisted at unnatural angles, its skin rippling and crawling as if something underneath was trying to escape. Its eyes, still glowing that hellish red, locked onto mine. Jake, ... Come out, ... It took a step closer, and I saw the blood. Its mouth and hands were smeared with it, and in its hand it held something small and dripping. My stomach churned as I realized it was a rabbit, its body torn apart, entrails dangling like grotesque ornaments. I scrambled back, tripping over my gear, my mind racing. Skinwalker. The term surfaced from some long-buried memory of campfire stories. Creatures that mimic human voices, take on the appearance of animals, and wear the skin of their prey. My skin prickled with fear. The creature began to tear at the tent, its claws ripping through the fabric with a horrifying ease. I slashed at it with my knife, feeling the blade connect with something solid. It screamed again, that same inhuman wail that made my ears ring and my blood run cold. I bolted from the tent, running blindly into the forest. Branches whipped at my face and arms as I tore through the underbrush. My lungs burned, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I could hear it behind me, crashing through the trees, getting closer. I stumbled into a clearing and saw an old, abandoned cabin. Desperation fueled my steps as I ran inside, slamming the door behind me. The cabin was dark and musty, the air thick with decay. The silence inside was almost as oppressive as the sounds outside. I could hear the creature scratching at the walls, circling, searching for a way in. The scratching was relentless, a constant reminder of the danger just beyond the walls. I backed into a corner, clutching my knife, every nerve in my body screaming for escape. Hours passed, the scratching and growling outside relentless. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, dawn broke, light filtering through the cracks in the walls. The noises stopped. I waited, holding my breath until I was sure it was gone. I slowly made my way outside, my body trembling with fatigue and fear. The forest was eerily silent. My camp was a wreck, my tent was shredded, my gear scattered and torn. The fire pit was nothing more than a blackened scar on the ground. The surrounding trees seemed to bear witness to the chaos that had unfolded. I quickly grabbed what was left of my belongings, my movements frantic. The sense of urgency was overpowering. I couldn't get out of those woods fast enough. My steps were hasty, my mind racing as I pushed through the dense underbrush, the feeling of being watched never leaving me. Once I reached the edge of the forest, I didn't stop. I kept moving until the trees were nothing more than a distant line behind me. I didn't dare look back, fearing that the thing might still be out there, lurking just beyond my sight. I don't know what that thing was, but I'll never go back to Blackwood Forest. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear that voice in my head calling my name in that twisted, mocking tone. I wonder if it's out there, waiting for me to make another mistake. The thought is a constant, gnawing dread, a reminder of the darkness that lies hidden in the places we think we know best. It's a fear that has taken root deep within me, an unsettling echo of an encounter I can never fully escape. This is a true story, something I experienced firsthand. It must have been over a decade ago by now. I was a kid when my dad bought a cozy house on the outskirts of a small town. The house was decently sized, with a large backyard that overlooked marshes and unused farmland. The only way to enter the property was either through the house or by crossing the vast fields. This becomes important later because my bedroom, at the time, was located at the back of the house, facing that large backyard. There is one night I remember vividly, around 10 to 12 years later. I was sitting in my room, working on some digital artwork on my computer. It was one of my favorite things to do as a teenager. I usually wore headphones and listened to music while working. The way I was sitting had me facing slightly away from the big window in my room, which was the largest in the house. I had blackout blinds drawn, and it was the only room in the house with the lights on. From outside, you could probably see small slivers of light through the edges of the blinds. I think it was between 2:30 and 3 a.m. I was quietly minding my own business, and suddenly I heard a massive slam against my window. It was a dull but loud thud, followed by what sounded like a shot. My dad was fast asleep in the room next to mine. To this day, I am amazed that he did not hear anything. I just sat there, frozen, unsure of what I had just heard. Then it happened again. This time I heard it clearly. Someone was outside my window in the backyard. Whoever it was had no reason to be there. I was too scared to open the blinds. Instead, I got up and stared at the window, never taking my eyes off it. Thankfully, I trusted my gut. It was telling me to grab a flashlight and check the front door. Since this was an old house, I had to leave the comfort of the house and walk through the barn to reach the main entrance. I remember shining my flashlight through the frosted glass on the door. As soon as I lifted the flashlight a few inches, I saw the coat of the person standing outside. Then terror truly set in when I realized the front door had not been locked this entire time. I quickly locked it and ran back inside. In a panic, I grabbed the first thing I could find, a bread knife. Not the most practical weapon, but when your adrenaline is surging, you do not think clearly. I tried to wake up my dad, who was completely passed out, and urged him to check outside. We never found the person, and they never came back. To this day, I wonder what would have happened if I had not locked that door, prank or not. I dread to think about it. I have experienced many unsettling things in my life, but nothing scares me more than people. It was late, much later than I normally stayed at the shop. The clock on the wall showed a little past midnight, and the air was thick with a stillness that only happens in the dead of night. The faint hum of the overhead fluorescent lights was the only sound, creating an eerie backdrop to my solitary work. The shop was completely empty, just me, and the cars, a few scattered tools, and the dull glow of the single overhead light struggling to stay on. I had been working on an old sedan for hours, trying to fix an issue with the suspension. The vehicle was jacked up, giving me just enough room to slide underneath and reach the parts I needed to tighten. It was routine work, but the silence of the night was unsettling. Usually the noise of engines and tools drowned out any thoughts, but tonight there was nothing but the occasional creak of the building settling and the faint whistle of the wind outside. As I lay on my back beneath the car, tightening the bolts on the suspension, I felt a sudden, sharp jolt. The entire car shifted above me. My heart stopped, and I instinctively rolled to the side just as the car dropped several inches, the jack collapsing under its weight. The metal frame slammed into the concrete floor with a deafening crash. Missing me by a fraction of an inch, I scrambled out from under the vehicle, my chest heaving and my hands shaking uncontrollably. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. How could the jack have failed? It was new, perfectly calibrated. This was no accident, I thought. Someone must have tampered with it. Wiping the sweat from my brow, I stood up, my legs still trembling, and walked over to the jack. I examined it closely, but nothing seemed wrong with it. The realization that I had almost been crushed hit me like a wave, and I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. As I stood there, trying to steady my nerves, the light above me flickered. I glanced up at it, squinting as it dimmed for a few seconds before buzzing back to life. The shop felt different now, heavier somehow, like the air itself was watching me. I turned back toward the car, but something caught my eye at the entrance. A shadow moved. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. At the open garage door, a figure stood just at the edge of the light, unnervingly still, barely visible in the dim glow. My first thought was that it was someone from the shop coming to check on me, maybe one of the guys playing a prank. But as I looked closer, I could see something was off. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, its posture unnaturally rigid, like it wasn't quite human. I swallowed hard, trying to calm myself. "Hey, who's there?" I called out, my voice sounding smaller than I intended. There was no response. The figure remained motionless, and the longer I stared, the more I felt a creeping sense of dread building in the pit of my stomach. I took a step toward the figure, but before I could say anything else, it moved. Slowly, deliberately, it began to advance toward me. My body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to run. But I couldn't. My legs felt like they were rooted to the spot. As the figure came closer, I could make out more details. It was a man, or at least, it looked like a man. His clothes were dirty and torn, like he had been wandering for days. His head was cocked at an unnatural angle, and his face his face was wrong. His mouth was twisted into a grotesque smile, far too wide, as if the skin had been stretched beyond its limits. The grin never reached his eyes, which were dark, hollow, and devoid of any human emotion. In his hand he dragged something along the wall, a long metallic object scraping against the concrete. The sound was piercing, like nails on a chalkboard. My skin prickled with fear as I realized what it was, part of the jack from the vehicle I had been working on. The same jack that had almost killed me. My breath caught in my throat as he stepped fully into the light. His smile grew wider as he raised the jack piece in the air, tilting his head in a mocking gesture. "I messed that up," he whispered, his voice low and rasping, barely audible over the sound of my own heartbeat. "Let's try again." Without thinking, I backed away, my eyes darting around the shop for something, anything I could use as a weapon. My tools were scattered, just out of reach. I cursed under my breath, my mind racing for an escape plan. The figure took another step closer, dragging the metal jack piece across the floor with an eerie, deliberate slowness. His smile never wavered, his dark eyes locked on mine with a hunger that made my stomach turn. There was no doubt in my mind now this was no prank. This was something far worse. I darted toward my toolbox, my hand fumbling for the largest wrench I could find. The figure was still advancing, his movements slow but deliberate, as if he knew there was no rush. He was enjoying this, savoring the fear that radiated off me. "Stay back," I shouted, holding the wrench out in front of me like a shield. My voice was shaky, betraying the terror I was trying to keep at bay. The figure paused for a moment, his head tilting again in that unnatural way. His smile faltered for just a second, but then it returned, even wider than before. "Why?" he whispered, his voice dripping with malice. "I'm just here to help you finish the job." My heart was in my throat as he lunged forward, swinging the metal jack piece at me with a force that sent sparks flying as it connected with the concrete floor. I barely dodged the blow, my body moving on pure adrenaline. I swung the wrench wildly, catching him in the shoulder. The impact barely seemed to faze him, but it gave me just enough time to sprint toward the back door of the shop. I threw the door open and stumbled out into the night. The cool air hit my face, but it did nothing to calm the panic surging through me. I ran, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me, not daring to look back. The sound of scraping metal followed me, that horrible, grating noise growing louder with every step. I reached the end of the lot and ducked behind a row of abandoned cars, my chest heaving with exhaustion. I crouched down, clutching the wrench to my chest like a lifeline, my eyes wide and searching the darkness for any sign of movement. For a few moments, there was nothing, just the wind rustling through the trees and the distant hum of the highway. I allowed myself a single breath of relief, thinking maybe, just maybe, I had lost him. But then, from the shadows, that voice came again. "I messed that up, ... Let's try again." The scraping sound started once more, growing closer and closer. My blood turned to ice as I realized he was still hunting me, and there was no escaping his twisted game. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, when the world was gripped by uncertainty and fear, something far more terrifying entered my life, an encounter that still haunts me to this day. Many have claimed to see them, talk to them, or even disappear because of them. Skeptics dismiss these stories as urban legends, but I can tell you with absolute certainty, the black-eyed children are real. It was a quiet evening in Abilene, and I was alone at home while my grandfather underwent heart surgery. The hospitals were overrun due to the pandemic, and the isolation felt even heavier that night. My step-grandmother had dropped me off earlier, leaving me to my own devices. It was around 10 p.m. when I settled into the living room, my tea steaming beside me as I prepared to watch Dragon Ball Z on Toonami, a rare comfort in the chaos of the world outside. My two dogs were curled up on the couch, their usual calm presence reassuring me as I tried to push aside my worries about my grandfather. I was halfway through the episode when I heard a knock at the door. At first, it was faint, almost as if someone were tapping gently. I paused, muting the television, and glanced toward the front door. My dogs, who had been dozing moments before, immediately snapped to attention. Their ears perked up, and they both stared at the door, a low growl rumbling from their throats. Unease crept into me, but I brushed it off. It was late, sure, but maybe it was a neighbor or someone who needed help. Still, something felt wrong. My dogs rarely reacted this way to visitors, especially not with such aggression. As I approached the door, the knocking grew louder, more insistent. My hand was on the doorknob when one of my dogs, Max, bit down on my wrist, not hard enough to break the skin, but enough to stop me in my tracks. His growl intensified, and he tugged me back from the door with surprising strength. I looked down at him, startled. "What is wrong with you?" I whispered, more to myself than to the dog. But Max wasn't listening. His eyes were locked on the door, and his whole body was tense, as if he was preparing for something far worse than a stranger. On the porch, suddenly, a small face appeared in the front window, just at the edge of my vision. I jumped, my heart racing, as I turned to look. It was a boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, with pale skin, brown hair, and large black eyes that seemed to swallow the light from the porch lamp. He smiled, but it wasn't a smile of innocence. It was twisted, like he knew something I didn't. "Ma'am," he said in a voice that was too calm, too emotionless, "can you open the door? We came to play with a..." His voice sent a chill down my spine. My little sister's name was Aliyah, but she didn't live with me or my grandfather, and there was no reason this child should know about her. I stared at him, unable to speak, frozen by the sheer wrongness of the situation. My instincts screamed at me to get away from the door, but there was an almost magnetic pull to the boy's eyes, as if he were willing me to open the door. "Please, ma'am," he said again, his voice now sharper, more demanding. "We just want to play." Before I could react, there was another knock, this time from the side door. I whipped my head around, my heart pounding in my chest. How had someone gotten there so quickly? The windows in that part of the house were covered by thick curtains, but I could hear shuffling footsteps just outside, followed by a slow, deliberate tap on the glass. The air in the house felt heavy, oppressive, as if something far darker than the pandemic had found its way into my home. My dogs were in full alert mode now, growling and snarling at both doors, their eyes wide with fear. They had never acted this way before. Max continued to block me from approaching either door, his body trembling as he pressed against my legs. I had never seen him like this, not even when strangers came to the house. His terror only amplified my own. Desperate for solution, I backed away into the kitchen, trying to put some distance between myself and whatever was outside. But the knocking continued, relentless. Every few seconds, it would move first from the front door, then the side door, as if they were surrounding the house. My breath came in shallow, panicked gasps as I backed into a corner, clutching a kitchen knife in my trembling hand. "Let us in," the voice called again, this time from the side window. It was a different voice, higher pitched and eerily soft. Another child. I didn't want to look, but curiosity got the better of me. Slowly, I peeked around the corner and saw a second child, a little girl with dark hair and the same impossibly black eyes. She pressed her face against the window, her breath fogging the glass as she stared into the house. "We just want to see." The voices outside grew more insistent, the knocking more frantic. The sound seemed to reverberate through the walls, each knock vibrating deep within my chest. My dogs barked wildly, their hackles raised, but they didn't leave my side. I wanted to call someone, anyone, but my phone was in the living room, far too close to the front door for comfort. The last thing I remember is curling up on the kitchen floor, my dogs pressing close against me, their warmth the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. As the knocking continued, I squeezed my eyes shut, praying that the children would go away, that this nightmare would end. When I woke up, the house was silent. The sunlight streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. My dogs were lying beside me, exhausted but alert, their eyes still trained on the doors. The sense of dread lingered in the air, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than a simple late-night visit. I never told anyone about that night. What could I say? That I was nearly lured outside by children with black eyes, that they knew my sister's name and wanted to play with her. No one would believe me. But every now and then, when the night is quiet and the wind whistles through the trees, I think I hear that soft, persistent knocking. And I wonder what would have happened if I had opened the door. I still fear that one day they'll come back, and next time I won't be so lucky. It was a night like any other, or so I thought. The clock showed 11:30 p.m., and I, having no plans the next day, decided to turn in for the night. Little did I know that the events about to unfold would change my view of reality forever. Sleep came easily, as it usually did, but it was short-lived. I awoke suddenly, feeling disoriented, my eyes fluttering open to the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through my curtains. The room was bathed in a dim, bluish hue, casting strange shadows across the walls that my body was frozen in place. I tried to move my arms, my legs, even my head, but nothing responded. Panic surged through me as I realized I couldn't budge. It was as if some unseen force had bound me to my bed, leaving me paralyzed. My mind raced. Was I dreaming? Was this sleep paralysis? I had heard of such things, but never experienced it myself. As I lay there, unable to move, my eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, that could explain what was happening. And that's when I saw it. Across from my bed stood my mirror, an ordinary piece of furniture that now seemed to hold something far more sinister. Reflected in its surface was a figure, a tall, dark silhouette that loomed ominously across the room. My heart stopped as I took in the sight. It was not human. The shadowy figure stood unnaturally still, its form indistinct, yet unmistakably malevolent. What caught my attention the most were its eyes, bright white orbs that pierced through the darkness, locking on to mine with an intensity that sent chills down my spine. Out in the center of its chest, something glowed, a bright, white light, stark against the inky blackness of its body. It was as if the light was a source of life for the figure pulsing softly in the gloom. The longer I stared, the more terrified I became, but no matter how much fear gripped me, I couldn't tear my gaze away. The figure just stood there, staring at me, its presence overwhelming the room with a sense of dread I had never felt before. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but my voice was as frozen as the rest of my body. The only thing I could do was watch in helpless terror as the shadow man stood vigil, its glowing eyes never leaving mine. My thoughts raced. What was this thing? Why was it here? And what did it want from me? Suddenly, without warning, I felt a slight twitch in my fingers. Relief washed over me as I realized I could move again, albeit slowly. My first instinct was to leap out of bed and run, but something stopped me. My mind screamed at me to stay still, to remain in the safety of my bed. It felt like the smarter choice, though I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was fear, or perhaps some deeper instinct telling me that if I moved, things would only get worse. The shadow man remained in the same spot, motionless, yet I could feel its presence more intensely than before. A strange sensation began to fill the room, almost like it was communicating with me, not in words, but in thoughts. Something about its presence beckoned me, urging me to get closer, to stand up and walk toward it. The compulsion was strong, almost irresistible, but I fought it with everything I had. I didn't move. ICOULD and single quotes T. Time seemed to stretch as I lay there, trapped in this horrifying standoff. Minutes felt like hours. My eyes grew heavy, my mind fogged with fatigue, and, despite the terror coursing through my veins, I found myself slipping back into unconsciousness. The last thing I saw before sleep claimed me was the Shadow Man, standing as still as ever, his bright eyes boring into mine. When I woke up again, it was about an hour later. I was no longer paralyzed. My body felt normal again, and for a moment I allowed myself to believe it had all been a nightmare. But as my eyes adjusted to the dark room, that fragile sense of safety shattered. My mirror was still there, reflecting the same terrifying figure. Only now it was larger, its shadowy form looming over the entire room, its wide eyes burning brighter than before. Panic surged through me, but this time I acted foolishly, perhaps, but I acted. I scrambled out of bed, heart pounding in my chest, and moved to the small cot beside mine. I thought that if I could just turn away from the mirror, block the figure from my sight, I'd be safe. It was a childish hope, but it was all I had. I laid down on the other bed, pulling the blanket up over my head as if the thin fabric could somehow protect me. But it didn't. My heart felt heavy, unbearably so, as if something was pressing down on my chest. Breathing became difficult, each gasp for air more labored than the last. The room seemed to close in on me, and that dreadful presence grew stronger. I knew, without even looking, that the Shadow Man had moved closer. The compulsion to turn around, to face it, was almost unbearable. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to will it all away, but the oppressive weight on my chest only grew heavier. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. My eyes snapped open, and, to my horror, the figure was there, mere inches from my face. Its bright, glowing eyes stared into mine, so close I could feel the coldness radiating from it. I screamed loud and desperate, and the next thing I knew, my bedroom door flew open. My mother rushed in, turning on the lights in a panic. "What's wrong?" she asked, her eyes wide with concern. I pointed to the figure, my voice trembling. "Can't you see it's the black figure? It's right there." She looked around, her face creasing in confusion. "There isn't anything there," she said softly, walking over to my bed. But I could see it, still standing there just beyond her reach. I stared at it, frozen in terror. Even as my mother came closer, without hesitation, my mother grabbed the Quran from the shelf and began reciting surahs, her voice steady and firm. As she prayed, something shifted in the room. The heaviness that had suffocated me began to lift, and the figure, which had stood so solidly just moments before, started to fade. It didn't vanish immediately, but it grew less distinct, its edges blurring until all that remained was a single bright white dot hovering in the air. I watched as that last trace of the Shadow Man flickered once, then disappeared entirely. My mother stayed with me that night, her presence a comfort after the terrifying ordeal. I eventually fell asleep, though it was a restless, fitful slumber. The next morning, the room looked perfectly normal. There were no shadows, no strange lights, just the familiar, comforting sight of my bedroom bathed in the soft glow of the morning sun. But I'll never forget the Shadow Man. To this day, I can still see those piercing white eyes in my mind, watching, waiting. I haven't seen him since, but the fear that he might return lingers in the back of my mind. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and the shadows grow long, I think I can feel him watching me from the darkness, waiting for the right moment to come back. That night in 2006, in Dubai, changed me forever. When I was 18, back in 2008, I had a terrifying experience that still haunts me. I grew up in rural Kentucky, living near a senator who owned a huge stretch of farmland and woods. I often helped her with chores around her property during the summer to earn extra cash. The land stretched far, with parts of it connecting to unused public areas, fields, streams, and thick forests. It was a peaceful place, and my friend Auntie and his little brother Willie would often explore the woods with me, seeing how far we could go before having to turn back. On one particular fall day, we set out just before dusk, armed with flashlights in case it got dark. The ground was thick with fallen leaves, and we wandered deeper than usual. I soon realized we were going in circles, and as the sun disappeared, the sound of the nearby highway faded, leaving us isolated in the thickening dark. We kept walking, but before we knew it, the last of the light had gone, and it was well past 10 p.m. We were lost. Now, before you ask why we didn't just call for help, it's because back then I only had a flip phone, and service in the area was terrible. So we kept wandering, hoping to find our way out. Then it happened. The woods around us suddenly went completely silent. No rustling leaves, no animals, nothing. The quiet felt suffocating, like something dangerous was nearby. My dad had always warned me about moments like this, telling me that when the woods go silent, it means there's a predator around. Just then a soft whistle broke the silence. We stopped in our tracks, looking around frantically, trying to figure out where it was coming from. In a moment of panic, Auntie whistled back. A chill ran down my spine. Everyone knows you're not supposed to whistle back in the Appalachian woods, especially at night. I hit Auntie and whispered, "Why would you do that?" The whistling grew louder. "Run," I yelled, and we took off through the trees. The whistling followed us, getting softer as we sprinted, but we were completely disoriented now, more lost than before. Hours later, with the full moon providing the only light, we stumbled upon an old shack. It was dilapidated, but there was a faint glow coming from inside, like a fire was burning. We approached cautiously, opening the door and calling out to see if anyone was there. But then we heard the sound of leaves crunching behind us. We whipped around, but saw nothing. The whistling returned, now possibly close, and that's when we saw her, a woman standing just a few feet away. She looked ragged, her clothes torn and her face contorted with rage. We froze, shining our flashlights on her. "Hello?" Auntie called out, but before he could say another word, she started screaming a primal, blood-curdling scream that made my blood run cold. Without warning, she lunged at Auntie, and in a panic, he swung his flashlight, hitting her square in the face. She crumpled to the ground, but it didn't stop her. She got up, still screaming, and started chasing us. We ran for what felt like an eternity, her screams echoing through the woods as she chased us. She was fast, inhumanly fast, and no matter how hard we ran, we couldn't seem to lose her. Eventually, we dove into some bushes, hiding as best we could while we caught our breath. For an hour, we stayed hidden, too scared to move. But then the whistling started again, and we knew we had to keep going. We ran and ran, the sound of her footsteps and the faint whistle always just behind us. Then, finally, we heard the faint roar of the highway up ahead. We stumbled onto the road, waving frantically for help, but car after car sped by, not stopping. Eventually, a man pulled over, his face pale when he saw us. We jumped into his car, panting and terrified. We told him what had happened, and he wasn't surprised. He explained that the woods were home to a lot of homeless people and drug addicts, some of them dangerous. He drove us home, and none of us ever went back into those woods again. And that, folks, was the night I nearly lost my mind and my pants running from something I'll never forget. Hey, I've been reading through the stories here and thought maybe it's time I share one of my own. I don't usually talk about it, but every now and then the memories creep back in, and I think about how close I came to something truly terrifying. I grew up in Austin, Texas, and this happened when I was still in my teenage years. You know, that age where you think nothing bad could ever really happen to you. Looking back, I realize how naive I was. I had this friend, let's call him John. John and I were pretty tight back then. We spent a lot of time playing video games together, mostly Xbox. One day, my mom decided to head out for the evening, leaving me alone in the house. She trusted me to be responsible, and for the most part, I was. But being a teenager, the moment she left, I invited John over to hang out and play some games. It was all pretty normal at first. We were just goofing off, laughing, and getting absorbed in a new game. About 30 minutes in, though, we heard this loud crack, like something had snapped or fallen, coming from upstairs. At first, we didn't think much of it. I had two cats at the time, and they were always getting into things. I figured one of them had knocked something over, so we brushed it off and kept playing. 3 hours passed, and by then, we had completely forgotten about the noise. We were deep into our gaming session, focused, when suddenly, without any warning, the power cut off. The entire house went dark. At first, I thought it was just a random outage, which happened sometimes in Austin during storms. But when I looked out the window, the street lights were still on, and the neighbor's house had power to. John started getting uneasy. Hey, man, I think I better head out. My mom's been texting, and she wants me home, he said. I couldn't blame him. The vibe in the house had shifted. Something felt off. We said our goodbyes, and after about 5 minutes, John was out the door, leaving me alone in the dark, eerily quiet house. I tried to shake off the weird feeling, telling myself it was nothing, just my imagination. I found a flashlight and spent the next half hour in the living room, scrolling through my phone and watching some stuff on TV. The power hadn't come back on yet, and I was starting to feel tired, so I decided it was time to call it a night. I went upstairs to my room, laid down, and eventually drifted off to sleep. But sometime around 2:30 in the morning, I woke up suddenly. At first I didn't know why. The house was silent, the kind of stillness that presses down on you and makes you feel like you're the only one left in the world. Then I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A muffled scream. I froze in my bed, my heart pounding in my chest. My mind raced, trying to figure out if what I'd heard was real. Maybe it was a nightmare, I thought. Maybe I'd just imagined it. But then there was another noise. This time, it was the sound of the back door creaking open. That's when I remembered I had forgotten to lock it. Panic surged through me. I'm a pretty big guy, not easily scared. But in that moment, I was terrified. Every muscle in my body tensed, and I tried to think of what to do. My first instinct was to grab something to defend myself. My hand reached for the hammer I had left on my nightstand. I'd been using it a few days before to hang some art on my walls, and now it was the only thing standing between me and whoever or whatever was downstairs. I held the hammer tightly, my knuckles turning white as I strained to listen. The sound of heavy footsteps echoed through the house, growing louder with each passing second. Whoever it was, they were coming closer, and the footsteps weren't quiet. They were deliberate, almost like the person wanted me to hear them. I couldn't just sit there. My body acted on instinct, and I bolted for the closet. I shut the door as quietly as I could and crouched down, trying to make myself as small and silent as possible. My hand shook as I pulled out my phone and Dialed 911. 911. What's your emergency? The operator answered, her voice calm and professional. There's someone in my house, I whispered, my voice barely audible. I'm hiding in my closet. Please, send someone fast. The operator assured me that help was on the way, but the minutes felt like hours. Every second stretched out, and I could hear the intruder moving through the house. My heart was pounding so hard I thought for sure he could hear it. Then I heard him coming up the stairs. His footsteps grew heavier, closer, until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I held my breath, gripping the hammer tighter, my eyes fixed on the sliver of light coming through the closet door. The silence was unbearable. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, and I prayed that he wouldn't open the door. But then I remembered I had left the Xbox on. It was a stupid mistake, one I'd regret for the rest of my life. I heard him step into my room, his feet shuffling across the floor. He stopped, frozen in place, as if something had caught his attention. My mind raced. Did he see something? Did he know I was hiding? The tension built, and for what felt like an eternity, he just stood there. Then, suddenly, he bolted. I heard his footsteps pounding down the stairs, and my heart nearly stopped. And then I heard them, the sirens. They were getting closer. I let out a breath I didn't realize I had been holding, whispering, "Thank God," under my breath. The intruder must have heard them too, because I heard the door slam shut. I peeked out the window, just in time to see a cop car pull up to the house, and one of the officers sprinting toward the backyard. I slowly crept out of the closet, my body trembling from the adrenaline. I made my way downstairs, cautiously, and opened the front door. That's when I saw him, the man who had broken into my house. He was pale, almost sickly white, like a ghost. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, and he was so thin I could see the outline of his ribs through his shirt. But the most disturbing part, he didn't have lips, just a grotesque, toothy grin that made my stomach turn. The cops had him in handcuffs, pushing him into the back of the squad car. And then, out of nowhere, he vomited. But it wasn't just any vomit. He spewed blood all over the back window of the cop car. It was like something out of a horror movie. I stood there, frozen in shock, unable to look away. The cops drove off not long after. And the next day, I found out what had happened. The man had overdosed that night. Turns out he was high on meth when he broke into my house, and the overdose is what eventually killed him. It was a night I'll never forget, one that still haunts me to this day. And I've got more stories like this, ones that are just as creepy, if not worse. If you all want to hear them, let me know. I'm happy to share. Long ago, when I was just 15, I had one of the most chilling experiences of my life, something that still haunts me to this day. I grew up in a small, quiet town where everyone knew each other. Nothing bad ever seemed to happen, so I felt safe, that is, until the events of one unforgettable night shattered that sense of peace. My parents were away for the weekend, leaving me under the watch of my older sister, Emma. She was 16 and thrilled at the idea of being in charge for once. That evening, we decided to watch a movie together, enjoying the rare bit of freedom. Halfway through the film, there was a knock at the door. Emma paused the movie and went to check, thinking it might be a neighbor or a friend. But when she opened the door, there was no one there. We shrugged it off, figuring it was just some neighborhood kids pulling a prank. A few hours later, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I heard a strange tapping sound at my window. My heart started racing. I was terrified of the dark, but curiosity got the better of me, so I peeked through the blinds. What I saw made my blood run cold. There, standing in our backyard, was a figure dressed in all black. The person or thing was completely still, just staring at the house. I couldn't see their face in the dim moonlight, but the sight of them was enough to send me sprinting to Emma's room. I woke her up, breathless and shaking, and dragged her to the window to look. But when we peeked out, the figure was gone. Emma tried to calm me down, telling me it was probably just some kid trying to scare us. We went back to bed, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. The next morning, we told our parents what had happened, but they dismissed it. They said it was probably just a lost traveler or someone from the neighborhood playing a prank. Still, I couldn't get the image of that figure out of my head. The following night, the tapping returned louder, more persistent. It sounded like someone was deliberately trying to rattle us. I woke Emma again, and this time she was scared too. She tried calling our parents, but there was no answer. We were alone, and the fear was palpable. Emma decided to call the police, but just as she picked up the phone, the tapping suddenly stopped. We breathed a sigh of relief, but the uneasiness lingered. We tried to sleep, but just when we started to relax, a loud crash echoed from downstairs. The sound was so sudden and violent that we both jumped out of bed. Emma grabbed a flashlight, and we cautiously made our way down the stairs. What we found in the living room sent chills down my spine. Books had been thrown from the shelves, and the couch cushions were scattered all over the floor, as if someone had been tearing through the place. Then we heard a soft whisper coming from the kitchen. It was faint, but we could make out a slow, haunting tune being sung. We stood frozen for a moment, too scared to move. Emma grabbed my arm and motioned for us to sneak back upstairs, but as we turned, the kitchen light flicked on by itself. That was it. We bolted upstairs, locked ourselves in my room, and pushed the dresser against the door. We huddled together on the bed, trembling, trying to stay as quiet as possible. But then we heard the slow, heavy sound of footsteps coming up the stairs. They stopped right outside my room. The doorknob began to rattle, gently at first, then more violently. We clung to each other, terrified. Then a voice came from the other side of the door. It was soft, raspy, and terrifyingly calm. "I know you're in there, kids." We didn't make a sound. We just sat there, barely breathing, praying it would stop. After what felt like an eternity, the footsteps receded, and the house fell silent again. We stayed awake all night, too scared to close our eyes. When our parents returned the next morning, they found us still in my room, the dresser barricading the door. We told them everything, and they immediately called the police. The officers didn't find any signs of forced entry, but they did find footprints in the dirt outside my window and around the perimeter of the house. My parents didn't take any chances after that. They installed security cameras and an alarm system, and the police increased their patrols in our neighborhood. But despite their efforts, they never found the person who stalked us that night. Years later, I still think about what happened. I don't know if it was some twisted prank or something far more sinister, but the fear I felt was real. And sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still hear that faint tapping on my window. Every time I freeze, wondering if my stalker has finally returned. When I think back to my childhood, one particular memory stands out. It's bizarre, fragmented, and haunting, but I can't shake the feeling that something was off that day. I was between 5 and 8 years old, living in Manteca, California. My dad worked at a place called Don's Auto Glass, and every now and then my mom would take me to visit him after school. I was always excited to go. It felt like a small adventure. That day was just like any other. My parents were talking, So I did what any hyperactive kid with ADHD would do. I found something to entertain myself. I spotted a big horsefly buzzing around the building and made it my mission to catch it. After a few minutes of chasing, I trapped it in a foam water cup from the Ice Mountain dispenser. Proud of my capture, I took it outside, grinning ear to ear, and that's when things started to get weird. As I stepped outside, I noticed something strange. The street, which was usually bustling, was dead quiet. No cars driving by, no people walking around, not even birds in the sky. The stillness was eerie, but at that age, I didn't really think much of it. But there was one person, an old man walking down the street. He was the only living soul in sight, and he was heading straight toward me. Now, here's where it gets unsettling. He wasn't like any old man I'd ever seen before. He had this odd, innocent yet menacing presence about him, like he wasn't quite right. He was wearing a long black leather jacket, the kind with 4 pockets, 2 on the outside and 2 inside. His hat was black, his eyebrows gray, and his face was clean-shaven. His eyes, though, they were empty, like looking into a void. I can't explain it, but even as a kid, I knew something was wrong. He started talking to me, just small, innocent questions. How's your day going? What are you doing out here? Harmless stuff, right? But something in his voice felt like he knew me. Like he knew me in a way that sent shivers down my spine. Then, out of nowhere, he opened his jacket. For a split second, I froze, thinking, what is this guy about to do? But instead of something creepy, he pulled out a children's bedtime storybook. It had a bear and a moon on the cover, dark blue with gold-edged pages. He handed it to me and said, I have a gift for you, in this smooth, knowing tone, like he had been waiting to give it to me for a long time. As a kid, I was excited. A free book. Cool. But the more I think about it, the stranger it feels. The next thing I remember, my mom came rushing outside. She thanked the old man and hurried me back inside as fast as possible. I don't know if she was creeped out by him or just concerned, but she acted fast, and I never saw that man again. The weirdest part, that book hits the only one from my childhood that's missing. I had tons of books, kept them all, but not that one. I never even read it. Now, at 22, I've been thinking about this memory almost obsessively. It pops into my mind at random moments, and every time it does, I get this gut feeling like something more was going on. I know it sounds ridiculous to say I met the devil, but I can't help but feel like that's what it was. Not in a cartoonish, red-skinned, horned kind of way, but in a sinister, subtle form. There was something about that man, his long fingers, his crooked smile, the empty streets at 3 p.m. in a normally busy town, that just didn't sit right with me. What makes it even weirder is that no one remembers this happening. My mom doesn't recall the man, and my dad brushes it off like it never even happened. But it did. I know it did. I've always been fascinated by the idea of meeting God or the devil, but this memory haunts me. Sometimes, when I think about it, I get this chilling sense of déjà vu, like the man is whispering in my ear, "You've met me already." It doesn't help that around the same age, I witnessed a family get hit by a train, something I also remember in brutal detail. Life can be strange and tragic, but every now and then I wonder, did I really meet the devil that day, or was it all just the imagination of a young, curious kid who got caught in a moment too strange to understand? I'll probably never know, but I can't shake the feeling that whatever happened that day was far from normal. This happened several years ago when I was still in high school The time when everything felt simpler until it wasn't. Every day after school, I'd ride the bus back home, just like any other student, barely paying attention to the route we took. It was a routine, one that felt safe, comfortable. The biggest worry on my mind was homework or what my friends and I would do that weekend. But that all changed when tragedy struck our quiet, unsuspecting community. It started with news that shocked everyone. A 3-year-old girl had gone missing. Her name was Mia, a sweet little thing with curly brown hair and big, innocent eyes. I didn't know her personally, but it felt like the entire town did. The news hit like a punch to the gut because things like that didn't happen where I lived. Crime? Sure, we had some, but it was mostly minor stuff, petty theft, maybe a bit of vandalism here and there. Nothing serious, nothing that made you fear for your safety or, worse, for the safety of the most vulnerable among us. But a missing child. That was a different kind of fear, one that sank deep into the bones. The moment the news broke, it was like a shadow had fallen over the whole town. You could feel it everywhere: the grocery store, the post office, at school. People talked in hushed voices, their expressions grim, their hearts heavy. And then it hit the TV. Every news channel was plastered with her face, the small, smiling face of that little girl, her brown eyes shining with a kind of innocence that seemed too pure for what the world had in store for her. The whole community was heartbroken. People volunteered to help search for her, combing through fields, forests, and streets, hoping, praying that she'd be found alive. But with each passing day, hope began to wane. Days turned into a week, and still there was no sign of Mia. Her parents made public pleas, tearfully begging for her safe return, their voices cracking with desperation. My friends and I talked about it endlessly on the bus ride home, imagining the worst but hoping for the best. Then, one day, it all changed. I remember that afternoon vividly. It was a gray, overcast day, the kind where the sky looks like it could burst into rain at any moment. I was on the bus, staring out the window, the same view I had seen 1,000 times before. We passed over a culvert, just like we did every day, a nondescript drain pipe beneath the road that I had never given a second thought to. But this time, as we drove over it, I noticed something strange: flowers. There were flowers, balloons, and small stuffed animals placed at the entrance of the culvert. And it hit me like a ton of bricks. That was where they found her. The little girl, Mia, had been right there, under that road, the very road my bus traveled every single day. The realization sent a shiver down my spine. The bus, with all of us laughing, talking, living our lives, had been passing over the place where her lifeless body had been hidden for days. I couldn't comprehend it at first. The idea that something so horrific had been lurking beneath the surface of such an ordinary spot was terrifying. It wasn't long before the whole town knew. Flowers and tributes piled up at the site, and every time we drove by, the weight of it all settled heavily in my chest. It felt surreal knowing that while I was going about my day, coming home from school, a tragedy had been hiding just below my feet. The feeling was unbearable. I remember sitting on the bus, unable to focus on anything but that culvert, my mind replaying the horror over and over. And then the truth came out, and it was even worse than we could have imagined. The little girl's father, the one who had tearfully begged on the news for her return, had been lying all along. His story about leaving her outside as punishment for not drinking her milk was just that, a story, a twisted fabrication to cover up the dark truth. He eventually confessed, unable to bear the weight of his lies any longer. What he revealed was chilling. According to him, Mia hadn't just wandered off that night. No, she had choked while he was forcing her to drink her milk. In his panic, instead of calling for help, he made a horrible decision. Afraid of the consequences, he didn't reach out to the police, to paramedics, to anyone who could have helped. Instead, he watched as she took her final breath, and then, in a cold, heartless move, he disposed of her tiny, lifeless body in the culvert right under the road we all traveled on every day. It was unthinkable. How could a father do that? The whole town was in disbelief. The man was arrested, of course, and eventually sentenced to life in prison, but the damage was already done. The trust was broken. It made me see the world differently, made me realize that sometimes the real monsters aren't lurking in the dark. They're the ones who are supposed to love and protect us. I still think about it sometimes, especially when I drive by that spot. The culvert is still there, of course, though the flowers and balloons have long since been cleared away. But for me and for the others, remember, that place will always be a reminder of innocence lost, of a tragedy that struck too close to home, and of a terrible secret that lay buried beneath our feet for far too long. For starters, I'd like to say that, personally, I do not believe in ghosts. I never have. Despite that, I've always been fascinated by the stories people tell about them, the unexplained occurrences, the cold spots, the eerie sounds in the dead of night. I think it's that mysterious allure, the way something can't be explained, that keeps me interested. Even though I am skeptical, whenever my family goes on vacation, we try to include at least one ghost tour in our plans. It's like an unspoken tradition at this point, whether it's an old mansion, a graveyard, or a haunted inn. We enjoy hearing the spine-chilling tales of apparitions from tour guides who seem to delight in making us jump at every creak of the floorboards. Many years ago, back when I was still in elementary school, we had a party to attend. It was a typical family gathering, one of those events where you're surrounded by relatives, family, friends, and a mixture of people you don't know, but are somehow related to through complicated webs of connections. This particular party was being held at a community center, a modest, plain building that wasn't exactly impressive, but had enough space for everyone to gather. The adults, as usual, were chatting and laughing in one part of the hall, while the kids, myself included, were running around pretending to be detectives or superheroes or whatever game we had conjured up that day. We were playing make-believe, as kids do, and decided that one of the rooms in the community center was haunted. I do not remember why we chose that specific room. Maybe it was darker than the others, or maybe the paint was peeling just enough to give it a spooky vibe. But once we made that decision, it was like the whole game changed. Suddenly, we were not just kids running around. We were ghost hunters on the verge of a great discovery. I remember how seriously we took it, sneaking around corners and peeking into the shadows, trying to spot something paranormal. Later on, as I casually mentioned our haunted room to my mom in passing, one of my grandma's friends overheard the conversation. Her name was Sister Mary, a woman who had been a nun for several years, but had since left the nunhood. She had that calm, serene air about her, the kind that made you think she had seen some things but was at peace with them. She approached me and, with a twinkle in her eye, asked if I wanted to hear a true ghost story from her own life. Now, this immediately piqued my interest. Hearing about ghosts from someone who had actually lived in a rectory that was too good to pass up. Sister Mary started her story by explaining how years ago, when she was still a nun, she lived in a rectory alongside other nuns. The rectory itself was an old, somewhat imposing building. She described it as a place where the halls were long and the nights were quiet. save for the occasional whispers of the wind outside or the distant creaks of the floorboards beneath their feet. It was the kind of place where, even if you didn't believe in ghosts, you might feel something watching you every now and then. One particular night, she and two other nuns were walking down the hallway. One of the nuns was much older than the others, a frail woman who had spent most of her life in service to God. As they strolled down the dimly lit corridor, Sister Mary said she felt a chill in the air, the kind that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand up. They were talking quietly, probably about something mundane, when suddenly, without warning, the older nun collapsed. She fainted right there in the hallway, her body crumpling to the floor like a rag doll. Sister Mary and the other nun rushed to her side, lifting her up gently and guiding her to her room. Naturally, they were concerned and confused. The older nun was pale, her face drained of all color, and her eyes were wide with terror. They asked her what had happened, what had caused her to faint so suddenly. After catching her breath, the older nun, still trembling, explained what she had seen. As they were walking down the hallway, she claimed to have seen another nun walking across the room ahead of them. Now, given that this was a rectory, a place where nuns lived, seeing another nun in the hallway should not have been unusual. But what she saw was anything but ordinary. The nun she described was outlined in a strange, faint blue glow, a soft, ethereal light that shimmered around her as she walked. And that was not the only thing that was strange. The most unsettling part of the whole encounter, according to the elderly nun, was that the hallway was supposed to be empty. There were no other nuns in that part of the rectory at the time, and the three of them were the only ones present in the hall. The blue-outlined figure had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, walked across the room, and then vanished without a trace. Sister Mary admitted that when she first heard the story, she was skeptical. After all, the elderly nun had lived a long life, and it was not uncommon for older people to experience moments of confusion or hallucination. Perhaps her mind had been playing tricks on her, but the older nun was adamant what she saw was real as the ground beneath their feet. She swore up and down that the glowing figure she had witnessed was no figment of her imagination. What made the story even more puzzling was that the rectory had no history of hauntings. No one else had ever reported seeing anything unusual, and there were no stories of ghosts or spirits attached to the building. This was the first and only time that something like this had ever happened there, making it all the more mysterious. Sister Mary said that while she didn't fully believe the elderly nun's tale, the way the woman had described it with such conviction and fear made her wonder. Eventually, Sister Mary left the nunhood, choosing a different path in life. She never went back to that rectory, and the strange incident faded into the background of her memories. Still, she admitted that while she was certain the whole situation was likely just the imagination of a senile old woman, there was always a small part of her that wondered if maybe, just maybe, the elderly nun had seen something that night, something that defied explanation. As she finished her story, I remember feeling both intrigued and unsettled. It wasn't the scariest ghost story I had ever heard, but there was something about it, the quiet, eerie nature of the sighting, the blue outline, the absolute certainty in the old nun's voice that stuck with me. Even now, years later, I can't help but wonder about that glowing figure in the hallway of the rectory and whether or not it was real. When I was a kid growing up in Abilene, Texas, my friends often begged me to stay the night at their houses rather than coming to mine. You see, I had something in my house, a presence that none of us could quite explain. My friends called him the Shadow Man. At first, it sounded like just another childhood tale, a story we would tell ourselves to get spooked. during sleepovers. But this was different. This was real. I know it sounds strange, maybe even unbelievable, but my friends remembered it too. Just the other day, we were catching up in a group chat, and one of them brought it up, laughing nervously as we revisited the memories that had once terrified us all. This shadow man wasn't like the kind of shadow you see when someone turns off the lights. No, this figure was different, darker, more tangible. He was tall, incredibly tall, towering at around 6'9", with long, clawed fingers that seemed to reach out for you even when he stood still. His face, or rather, the absence of one, was the most disturbing part. There was nothing where his features should have been, just a blank void of darkness. At first, it didn't seem too menacing. I remember nights when I'd be lying in bed, drifting off to sleep, and I'd feel him there, hovering just above me. He never moved, never touched me. He was simply there, watching, or at least, I think he was watching. It's hard to say when something has no face. My friends noticed him too, which made it harder to chalk it up to a childhood imagination. Whenever they slept over, they would whisper to each other about the shadowy figure that seemed to emerge from my closet when the lights went out. Sometimes we'd stay up late just to see if he'd appear, and more often than not, he did. He would stand in the corner at first, barely noticeable, just a dark figure blending into the shadows of my room. But as time passed, his presence became more unnerving. My friends stopped staying over as much, and when they did, they stayed awake, too afraid to sleep. One night, things escalated. I remember it vividly, though part of me wishes I didn't. My friends had agreed to spend the night, even though we were all secretly on edge, anticipating the arrival of the shadow man. Everything seemed normal at first. We stayed up late, played video games, and tried to act like we weren't scared. But as the night wore on, and the house grew quiet, we all started to feel it, that cold, creeping sensation that something was wrong. It was around 2 a.m. when it happened. We were all in bed, pretending to sleep, but still very much awake. Suddenly I felt a sharp tug at my blankets. I thought it was one of my friends playing a prank, but when I opened my eyes I saw him, the shadow man, looming at the foot of my bed. This time he wasn't just standing there like before. He moved toward me, his long, clawed fingers extending as if to grab me. Before I could even react, I felt his cold, jagged claws dig into my legs. Panic set in as he started dragging me off the bed, his grip tightening with every pull. I screamed, and my friends jumped up, terrified. They grabbed my arms and tried to pull me back, but it felt like the shadow man was stronger than all of us combined. He dragged me closer and closer to the closet, the very place he always seemed to come from. His growling echoed in the room, deep and guttural, like something from a nightmare. I could feel the pain in my legs as his claws dug deeper, and I remember thinking, this is it. He's going to take me into that closet, and I'll never come out. My grandparents, who had been out running errands, came home just in time. They heard the commotion and rushed into my room, where they found me halfway off the bed, my friends still holding on to me for dear life. The moment my grandparents turned on the lights, the shadow man vanished. I was left with bruises on my legs, deep purple marks that my grandparents could not explain. They rushed me to the ER to make sure I was okay, but no one believed me when I told them what had happened. The doctors chalked it up to a bad fall or an overactive imagination, but my friends knew the truth. They had seen him too. When my grandparents asked my friends what had happened, they hesitated before finally telling the truth. They said a scary man had tried to pull me into the closet. It sounded absurd, even to me, but I knew it was real. The shadow man was real, and he wasn't done with me yet. About a week later, I fell sick. I was bedridden with a high fever, and I could feel his presence more intensely than ever before. One night, as I lay in bed trying to sleep, I felt the same cold grip on my body. This time he didn't drag me towards the closet. Instead, he yanked me out of bed so violently that I hit the floor hard, leaving bruises from the fall. I cried out, but when my grandparents came to check on me, the shadow man had already disappeared. The bruises were the only evidence that something had happened, but even then, no one could explain how I had fallen so hard. The attacks continued for months. Every few nights he would show up, growling from the shadows, throwing objects around my room or dragging me out of bed. My friends stopped coming over altogether, refusing to even step foot in the house. They were too scared, and honestly, I couldn't blame them. I was terrified to dot, and then just as suddenly as it had all started, it stopped. After about 3 months of torment, the shadow man disappeared. There were no more growls in the night, no more attacks, no more flying objects. The only signs he had ever been there were the occasional thumps and crash from the closet, and sometimes, late at night, I would still hear the faint growling coming from the attic. But it was never as intense as before. Even though the attacks had stopped, my friends never came over for sleepovers again. The memory of the shadow man haunted us for years, and even now, as adults, we still talk about him sometimes, always with a nervous laugh and a glance over our shoulders, because no matter how much time passes, there's always that lingering fear that he might come back one day. And this time, I'm not sure we'll be able to stop him. I started a new job back in September as a behavioral health technician at a place considered a luxury drug and alcohol rehab facility. When I say luxury, I mean this place is massive, practically a mansion straight out of a movie. Imagine something like the Banks Mansion from The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, or a mini White House. It's 3 stories tall, with 13 rooms, and each room has its own private bathroom complete with jacuzzi tubs. There's a gym, 3 living rooms, a commercial-grade kitchen, a ballroom that doubles as a yoga studio, a doctor's office, a huge garden, and yes, it even has an elevator. Pretty impressive, right? Now, my schedule is the overnight shift 11 p.m. to 7:30 a.m., which means by the time I clock in, most of the clients are already asleep. It's usually just me and the nurse on duty in this enormous mansion. It's quiet, almost too quiet. My office is on the 2nd floor, while the nurse's office, the kitchen, and the pantry are on the 1st floor. For whatever reason, the pantry is always locked, and the nurse is the only one who holds the key. My first week on the job, I had a couple of clients tell me the place was haunted. I laughed it off, thinking it was just a typical rehab rumor, people telling stories to pass the time. But things took a turn a few weeks later. One night I was working as usual. The house was still, the clients were fast asleep, and I was in my office catching up on paperwork. Out of nowhere, the nurse came stomping up the stairs, practically yelling at me. She was furious, accusing me of hiding in the pantry to scare her. I was completely confused. I hadn't left my office all night. When I told her that, her face went pale, and she asked me, "You weren't just in the pantry?" and yelled, "Knock, knock." "No," I said. "How could I be? You have the key?" She didn't respond, just walked out, visibly shaken. About 10 minutes later, I heard her talking to herself. I went downstairs to check on her and found her in her office, down on her knees, praying softly, NPUNJABI. By the time 6 a.m. rolled around, the chef and the handyman clocked in. They asked how the night went, and I half-jokingly mentioned that Casper had scared Nurse J in the pantry. The chef gave me a knowing look and said, "Ho, that's K. If it was the pantry, it's definitely her." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. "What do you mean, K?" I asked. The chef explained that he had worked at the facility for 15 years, and before it became a rehab, the mansion had been a retirement home. Over the years, many residents passed away there. He even listed off certain former residents and the specific spots in the house where their ghosts had been seen. According to him, none of the spirits were malicious, just ... present. They've always been kind, he said. Not the haunting type that causes harm. As for Nurse J, that was her breaking point. She put in her 2 weeks' notice and left not long after. Since that night, I've noticed strange things myself, footsteps echoing down the empty hallways, flickering lights, and even fireplaces turning on by themselves. It's unsettling, to say the least, but nothing has spoken directly to me the way it did to Nurse J. The funny thing is, my pay is significantly higher than the average for this kind of job. When I first asked my supervisor why, he said it was because he can't seem to keep the night shift staffed. Now I have my own theory. I think it's because the place is haunted, and they know it. But honestly, the paycheck is too good to scare me away. If Kay and the other spirits want to flicker some lights and knock on pantry doors, that's fine by me. When I was 9, I had planned a sleepover with my friend after we went to a baseball game together. The day had started off great, but as we were heading back to her house after the game, the sky opened up, and it began to pour down rain. By the time we got to her place, we were drenched. I thought we were done with the adventure for the day, but my friend had other ideas. She wanted to go back outside and play in the rain. I wasn't exactly thrilled by the idea, but we were kids, and at that age, you don't think much about safety. So we went out and splashed around in her cul-de-sac. She lived at the very end of the street, in the last house, and it was a quiet, secluded area. I remember we were laughing and having fun until something small sparked an argument between us. It was one of those silly disagreements kids have, but in the moment it felt bigger than it should have. My friend, annoyed, stormed back toward her house and told me I should go home. I didn't have much of a choice, so I turned around and started walking home in the opposite direction. Now, instead of being in her quiet cul-de-sac, I was on the main road walking alone in the rain. The downpour had gotten heavier, and I was cold, wet, and angry. My house wasn't exactly close, and as I trudged along, I kept telling myself there was no way I was turning back. That's when I noticed it. Across the street, there was this tall, black figure just standing there, watching me. At first, I brushed it off, thinking my imagination was playing tricks on me because of the rain and how upset I was. But the figure didn't disappear. In fact, it followed me. It stayed on the opposite side of the street, keeping pace with me as I walked. A chill ran down my spine, but I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe it was just someone walking the same route. Then it happened the moment that made my heart drop. The figure stepped off the sidewalk and into the street. It wasn't just standing there anymore, it was coming toward me. The second I saw it moving in my direction, my instincts kicked in, and I ran as fast as I could, sprinting back to my friend's house. The rain was pounding down even harder, and my heart was racing in my chest. But all I could think about was getting away from that thing. I yelled out my friend's name as I ran, hoping she would hear me and come outside. Luckily, she did. When I got close to her house, she saw me and ran toward me, confused but concerned. I tried to explain as best I could, gasping for breath, and told her to get her mom. We both screamed for her as we ran back toward her house. Her mom rushed outside, and by the time we reached her, I was shaking with fear, certain the figure was right behind us. But when her mom looked, she didn't see anyone. She assured us that no one was there, but the fear didn't leave us. My friend and I stuck close to her mom for the rest of the night, and willing to leave her sight even for a second. It didn't help that her dad, who was a police officer, was working the night shift, so we didn't feel entirely safe even though her mom was doing her best to calm us down. As the night dragged on, we eventually went to bed, though I couldn't sleep. My mind kept replaying the image of that dark figure stepping into the street. But the real terror came later. In the early hours of the morning, her dad came home and woke us up. His face was serious, and I could tell something had happened. He told us that the figure he had seen was real. It wasn't just our imagination. Apparently, someone had been following us. The man had slipped while chasing us, which is why he didn't catch up. The police had found him, and when they searched him, they discovered that he was carrying some suspicious items on him, things that made the situation even more terrifying. The man had been taken to the hospital and was later arrested. To this day, thinking about that night gives me chills. I don't know what the man's intentions were, but the fact that he was chasing us in the rain and that he actually existed is something I'll never forget. I'm just grateful that we ran fast enough and that her mom was there when we needed her most. I was 17 when this happened, and it still haunts me. For context, I am an 18-year-old male from Nevada. It was August, and my friends, Star 16, female, and Adriana 17, female, and I came up with the bright idea to explore Lovelock Cave, about a 45-minute drive from where we lived. I had an old 1969 Ford F1, at the time, not in the best condition. The starter was on its last legs, the spark plugs were almost dead, and the engine timing was way off. Needless to say, getting that thing started, especially after it had cooled down, was a challenge. We set off around 6 p.m., and by the time we reached the base of the mountain leading up to the cave, the sun was starting to set. I tried driving my truck as far up the hill as I could to avoid walking more than necessary, but it could only go so far before I had to park it. The cave's entrance wasn't too far, so we decided to head in before it got too dark. As we approached the entrance, we heard strange knocking sounds coming from inside the cave. We exchanged uneasy glances, but shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just the wind or some other natural noise. We ventured deeper into the cave, hoping to see some of the legendary giant bones rumored to have been found there. The deeper we went, the louder the knocking became. It seemed to be following us, echoing through the narrow passageways. Star and Adriana kept looking at me, waiting for me to say something, but I couldn't shake the growing sense of dread creeping up my spine. Suddenly, the knocking turned into soft, eerie moaning. That's when the girls lost it and huddled behind me. I wasn't far behind them, fear crawling its way through my body as we turned to head for the exit. As we made our way out, the moaning grew louder. I shined my flashlight around, but nothing seemed out of place, at least not at first. But when I pointed the light toward my truck, I saw it. Something tall, towering, and deer-like was standing next to the truck. Its antlers were massive, almost like a moose's, and it was on its hind legs. I quickly moved the light away, hoping Star and Adriana didn't notice, but I knew I had to get them out of there. Get down, I whisper urgently, and we drop to our stomachs, crawling away from the truck. We hadn't gone far when we heard heavy footsteps behind us. That's when I knew whatever it was following us. Panic set in. I yelled for the girls to get up and run, telling them to follow my light. We bolted up the hill, running blindly in the dark, scrambling over rocks and brush as fast as we could. I didn't dare look back. My heart pounded in my chest as we ran, not knowing if we were gaining distance or if it was right behind us. Somehow we made it back to the truck, breathless and terrified. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking as I tried to jam them into the ignition. I finally got the key in, but the truck wouldn't start. The starter was dead. I knew what I had to do, but I didn't want to do it. I had to get out of the truck and manually tap the starter with a metal rod I kept with me for situations like this. I rolled down the window slightly, shining my flashlight around to make sure the creature was nowhere in sight. When I didn't see anything, I cautiously opened the door and crept to the front of the truck. As I crouched down, reaching under the fender to tap the starter, I heard Adriana and Star banging on the window, screaming. They were pointing behind me. I didn't even look. I just ran, heart pounding, back to the driver's side, feeling the creature's heavy breathing right behind me. I jumped into the truck and slammed the door shut, locking it just as something hit slam into the side of the door. I turned the key in the ignition, and the engine barely sputtered to life. The creature, whatever it was no longer deer-like. It looked like a decomposing human, its eyes ferocious as it banged against the truck door, determined to get in. I threw the truck into gear, headlights illuminating the thing standing in front of us. It froze like a deer in headlights. We all screamed as I floored it, reversing down the hill. The creature gave chase, but I managed to pull a flawless J-turn, gunning the engine as I shifted into first gear. Dust kicked up behind us as we sped down the dirt road, the creature still trailing us. As soon as we hit the asphalt, I kept my foot on the gas, driving as fast as I could, not daring to slow down until we were far away from Lovelock Cave. We were all on the verge of tears by the time we got home, our minds racing to figure out what we had just seen. That night, we did some research and came across something chilling. I won't say what we believe we saw, not here. The name itself is said to invite it back, and I have no interest in meeting it again. Whatever that thing was, we'll never forget it, and we'll never, ever go back to Lovelock Cave, especially not at night. This story took place when I was in elementary school, and it still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. At the time, my parents found an apartment they thought was nice and, more importantly, affordable. We didn't realize until later that cheap doesn't always mean good. We would eventually learn that this place wasn't as nice as it appeared. My mom and dad both had their own eerie encounters in that apartment, but I'll start by sharing my experience. It was a weekend, and my younger brother and I were at home. Our parents were at work. Like any typical day, we sat down in the living room to watch cartoons, chatting casually. Everything was normal until, out of nowhere, we heard the kitchen cabinet slam shut. The sound wasn't a casual bang, it was violent, like someone had slammed them with all their strength, as if in a fit of rage. Naturally, we were terrified. We knew for a fact that we were alone in the apartment, so hearing the cabinets slam like that sent us into a state of panic. But despite our fear, curiosity got the better of us. We cautiously walked to the kitchen to see what was going on. To our surprise, every single cabinet door was completely closed, looking untouched, like nothing had happened. There were no signs of disturbance. It was eerie. We told our parents what had happened when they got home, but as kids they thought we were just making up stories to mess with them. It wasn't long before they found out that we weren't making anything up. Let me share my mom's side of the story. I'll do my best to recount it as she told us. One day, after finishing up the laundry, she felt exhausted and decided to take a nap. My younger brother, who was with her that day, decided to nap with her as well. I was at school at the time, so it was just the two of them in the apartment. My mom said that when she woke up, she saw something that still haunts her to this day. She said she saw a figure crawling up the ceiling. It wasn't human, not by any stretch of the imagination. She described its skin as pitch black, almost like a shadow, but it had an unnerving, physical presence. What terrified her the most was when it turned its head to look at her. Its eyes, she said, were bloodshot red. It stared at her for what felt like an eternity, and she was so petrified that she closed her eyes, hoping it would go away. When she finally mustered the courage to open them again, the creature was gone. She told my dad and me that it wasn't a dream or sleep paralysis. She knew what she saw, and she was certain of it. To make things even more disturbing, my younger brother, who was only a little kid at the time, hugged her after the figure disappeared and told her, "Everything's going to be fine, Mom. He had seen it too." My mom clung to that memory, even though my brother doesn't remember it now. She insists that what she saw wasn't just in her mind. Then there's my dad's experience, and although it's shorter, it's just as unsettling. One evening, my dad heard loud banging on the door, as if someone desperately needed help. It was urgent, frantic. He was sitting close to the door, so he jumped up and opened it right away, thinking someone might be in trouble. But when he opened the door, no one was there. He looked around quickly, but there wasn't a soul in sight. He told us that it couldn't have been a prank. There wasn't enough time for anyone to run away and hide, especially with how quickly he had opened the door. It left him baffled. What made everything even stranger were the rumors we heard from our neighbors later on. Apparently, someone had been killed in that apartment before we moved in. We never found out if that was true or just a tale meant to scare new residents, but it didn't make us feel any better about living there. After all those unsettling experiences, we were just glad when we finally moved out of that place. In our new house, we haven't had anything paranormal happen, and for that I'm beyond grateful. I know some of you might think I'm making these stories up, but I'm not. These are real experiences that either happened to me or my family. Whether it was paranormal or just unexplainable, I can't say for sure, but it left a lasting impact on all of us and that apartment. It's a place I'd rather forget, but I feel like sharing these stories with others who might have had similar experiences makes it a little easier to understand. I was born deaf, but that hasn't stopped me from experiencing the strange and unexplained. I grew up in a town that had been devastated by two major floods. The most severe in 1889, a flood my family survived. Growing up, I lived in an old apartment complex, and strange things were a regular occurrence. But nothing quite like what I'm about to tell you. I was 5 years old, and my uncle lived in the apartment directly above ours. One night I couldn't sleep, so I decided to get out of bed and play with my Barbie dolls. I had this pink Barbie car, the non-mechanical kind, just plastic wheels, and Barbie herself sitting in the driver's seat. Suddenly, the car started moving on its own, rolling across the floor of my room. Confused but curious, I followed it. The car left my bedroom and rolled into the hallway, stopping suddenly at the meeting point between the hall and the dining room. That's when I saw it. A black figure, crawling on all fours, with piercing red eyes staring straight at me. Even though I was a friendly and innocent child, I knew something was wrong. Still, I waved and introduced myself. The figure didn't respond, but instead began slowly crawling toward me. I stood frozen, my heart pounding in my chest. Just as it lunged at me, it vanished, leaving behind a sickening, rotten smell that filled the hall. That wasn't the last strange encounter in that apartment. Not long after, I began seeing a little girl, except she wasn't quite like any little girl I'd ever seen. She had arms and legs twisted in strange directions, like a spider, and her skin was pale blue, like she'd been underwater too long. I called her Spider Girl. She wore an old, ragged white dress, soaked as if she had just been pulled from a river. Spider Girl never touched the floor. She preferred to hang around in the corners of my room, watching from above. I was a friendly child, and even tried to bribe her with candy, asking her to come down and play. She never spoke out loud, but somehow I could hear her in my head. She never liked to get too close, but she'd play with me as long as we didn't go near the floor. One day, I had an idea. I told Spider Girl we should take Barbie for a swim in the Barbie pool. The moment I mentioned water, she freaked out and disappeared. That night, my tall, pink dresser bolted to the wall. Mind you, came crashing down, right on top of the Barbie pool. I didn't hear the crash, but my mom and her boyfriend came running in to check on me. Sometimes at night, I'd hear her talk to me inside my head. She was terrified of water, and I couldn't understand why. One night, she said something that still sticks with me to this day. Water killed me. I told my mom about Spider Girl, but she just dismissed it as an imaginary friend. That all changed one afternoon. I was sitting in the living room watching a Disney movie while my mom was in the kitchen. Spider Girl appeared above the couch, hovering like she always did. "Ask your mom about the flood," she whispered. In my mind, I turned to my mom and asked her about the flood. Her reaction was immediate. She almost dropped the plate she was holding. "What flood?" she asked, her voice tense. "The Spider Girl wanted me to ask you about the flood," I replied. My mom hesitated, then finally said, "There were two floods, but the one in 1889 was the worst. A dam broke, and many people drowned. You'll learn about it in school eventually." I looked at her, trying to understand. Spider Girl is scared of water. She didn't know what to say. She brushed it off again, but I could tell the conversation left her uneasy. One night, my mom had to work a night shift, so she asked my uncle to babysit me. I was sitting on the couch, and Spider Girl appeared again, floating just above the armrest. I asked my uncle about the flood, but he didn't want to tell me much, worried I might have nightmares. As soon as Spider Girl appeared, my uncle's face went pale. He looked at me and whispered, "Is she here?" I nodded, smiling. "Yes, say hi to Spider Girl. This is my uncle." That was the last time my uncle ever stayed in that apartment. He moved out a month later and didn't talk about Spider Girl again until years later, when I was 13. When I saw him, he asked if I remembered her, and I told him I did. He explained that before our apartment building was built, the land was used for recovery after the flood. People would search for or bury their loved ones there. He even said he'd seen Spider Girl himself and believed she had drowned or perished in the fire at the dam. After doing more research, he told me she had gone missing during the flood. To this day, Spider Girl hasn't left me. Even after moving to another state, she still hangs around my room, watching from above. Sometimes girls at my deaf school's dorm would see her too, describing her exactly as I did. They didn't know about her, but somehow they saw her to. Spider Girl remains a part of my life, and as much as I've tried to help her, she still haunts the places where water once took everything from her. At 30, I became a single mom to a beautiful baby boy. After living with my parents for the first 2 months, I was ready to have my own space again and moved into an apartment. It was perfect, affordable, cozy, and it felt like a fresh start. I had returned to Canada after working overseas, deciding to stay close to family for the support and health care. Things were smooth for the first month, but by the second month, something changed. At first, it was subtle. I'd feel like I was being watched, but I brushed it off as exhaustion. Sleep deprivation does weird things to your mind when you have a newborn. One afternoon, I was in my room folding laundry while my son slept down the hallway. The baby monitor was on, and I heard him giggling. But then I heard something else, a little girl's voice, laughing and singing to him. I rushed to his room, but when I got there, he was awake and smiling. Alone. I told myself I was just imagining it, maybe hearing things because I was so tired. A couple of weeks later, it happened again, but this time it wasn't a little girl. I heard a man's voice through the baby monitor, talking to my son. This time, my baby wasn't giggling, he was crying. I ran into the room, my heart pounding. Again, there was no one there but him, though the hair on the back of my neck was standing up. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Weeks passed, and I tried to push the strange occurrences out of my mind. One night, around 2 a.m., I got up for a midnight feeding. I didn't turn on any lights because I didn't want to fully wake myself up. My room had no overhead lights, just a lamp by the window that I never used unless I was working over there. After putting my son back down, I returned to my room and found that very lamp, the one by the window, turned on. My heart dropped. That lamp was hard to turn on. The knob was stiff and needed some WD-40. There was no way it could have turned on by itself. Panicked, I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy bookend, and searched the apartment, fully expecting to find an intruder. But no one was there. The doors were locked, and nothing seemed out of place, except for the fact that I knew I wasn't alone. As if that wasn't enough, not long after, another bizarre thing happened. I had just finished feeding my son again in the early hours of the morning and came back to find a framed picture that had been hung on the opposite side of the room, now lying on the floor near my bed. There was no logical way it could have fallen there. The hooks were still intact, and it hadn't simply dropped off the wall. Something or someone had moved it. At this point, I was beginning to question my sanity. It was always around the same time, between 2 and 4 a.m., that these strange things happened. I still hadn't told anyone, not even my mom, because I didn't want people to think I was losing my mind. The sense of being watched grew stronger. Sometimes it felt mild, but other times it was almost suffocating. One night I decided to take a shower after getting my son down for bed. As I stood there, soaping up, the shower curtain suddenly moved, and the bathroom filled with a chilling cold air. My heart raced. I was stark naked and utterly terrified. I rinsed off as fast as I could and bolted out of the shower, trying to convince myself it was nothing, but things escalated that night. I went to bed trying to read to calm myself down. About 20 minutes into my book, the temperature in the room dropped dramatically. I was already tense when I saw something that shook me to my core. The pillow next to me compressed, as though someone had just laid their head down. But no one was there. That was the final straw. I grabbed my son, threw on some boots and a jacket over my nightgown, and ran out of the apartment. I didn't even take my purse. It was the middle of winter, but I didn't care. I drove to my parents' house, woke my mom up, and told her everything. My mom has always been a spiritualist, and she suggested I call a reverend from her church, who was a medium. The next day I awkwardly called and said, I think I have a ghost, and I need help. To my surprise and calmly reply, actually, you have 3. There's an old woman who sits in the corner and doesn't speak, a little girl, and a young man. I'm concerned about the young man. I was stunned. I hadn't told my mom the full details, and somehow knew exactly what was going on without ever stepping foot in my apartment. She offered to come the next day to clear out the spirit. When she arrived with another medium, I chose to stay in the house, but in a different room. The minute they started walking through, I felt a shift in the air, like a weight had been lifted. After they finished and explained what had been happening, the young man was a spirit who had died before he got the chance to have a family. When he saw me, a single mom with a baby, he decided to play house, pretending we were his. He hadn't meant any harm, but his presence was unwanted, and told him to leave, and he did so without resistance, and warned me that living in an apartment meant I might encounter more spiritual energy, as many people had lived there before. She recommended placing salt rock lamps around the house and visualizing a blanket of white light for protection when I slept. I took her advice, and from that day forward the strange occurrences stopped. Now, 16 years later, my son doesn't remember any of this, but I do. It was one of the scariest times in my life, and it changed my perspective on the spirit world forever. Ghosts are real, and they have their reasons for what they do. I'm no longer afraid of spirits, though I steer clear of anything potentially demonic. I've learned to respect the supernatural, but I'll never forget the young man who tried to play house with me and my son. And thanks to Anne and my mom, I no longer live in fear of the unknown. When I was 16, I started an apprenticeship in carpentry, and when there wasn't any woodwork to do, I'd be sent on various maintenance jobs around company-owned properties. I usually worked alongside a man we'll call Dave. Dave was polite and hard-working, but something about him always felt off. He had this strange habit of zoning out, and when he talked, he'd sometimes shift the conversation to awkward topics, especially about my mom. To give you some context, Dave had been married to my mom many years ago. They had kids together, but I wasn't one of them. Despite their history, I figured his questions were just his way of making small talk. But they started to get weird questions like, is her new partner nice to you, or is she happy with him? Even stranger ones, like, is her new partner controlling? As a 16-year-old, I didn't know how to handle it. I just tried to brush it off, thinking maybe he was just trying to be polite, albeit in a weird, over-intrusive way. After a few months of working with him, I found out that Dave had a new girlfriend, someone who lived about 15 minutes from him. They had apparently been together for a year. I didn't think much of it at the time, and I even told him I was happy for him. I hoped that this new relationship would keep him from prying into my mom's life and asking those uncomfortable questions. But as time went on, I started noticing some odd behavior. Whenever we drove to jobs, Dave would always take the same route, even if it was the longer way. I didn't question it at first, but I couldn't help but wonder why he was going out of his way. He'd also slow down when we got to certain areas, glancing at the sidewalks as if he was looking for someone. The air in the van would get heavy, and Dave barely spoke during those drives. Then one day, Dave asked me something that threw me off completely. He said, "How do you call someone when they blocked your number?" I wasn't sure how to respond, but I told him the truth that you could turn off your caller ID, but the person would still know was a hidden number. The question left me feeling uneasy, like I was somehow part of something wrong. But I tried to shake it off, reminding myself that it was public information and something he could easily Google. Still, I couldn't shake the weird feeling. A few days later, while we were on a job, Dave left his phone open on the van's seat, and I saw a string of messages he had sent that weren't going through. I know I shouldn't have looked, but my eyes locked on to messages. "Please talk to me. I don't know where I've gone wrong, and if you explain why you left, I won't message you again. I just need an answer." Suddenly, everything clicked: the strange routes, the odd questions, and now these desperate messages. I realized that Dave wasn't just a bit off. He was stalking someone. His new girlfriend. Most likely. I felt sick. Here I was working side by side with a man who was creeping around his ex's life, and I had unknowingly helped him by explaining how to call someone who had blocked him. I felt complicit, even though I had no idea what he was up to at the time. I didn't know what to do. So I confided in one of his children, my half-sibling. She was shocked and said she'd talk to him about it, telling me not to worry. But I couldn't stop worrying. Soon after, I decided to switch jobs, partly because I couldn't shake the uncomfortable feeling of working with him. Months passed, and then I saw something that chilled me to the bone. An article about a court case involving a stalker. The name, Dave's full name. The article detailed how he had been stalking his ex-girlfriend, bombarding her with messages and calls, showing up at her door at night, leaving gifts, and even following her while she walked her dog in the woods. He had even gone as far as deliberately bumping into her at the grocery store and scratching up his own van to frame her. Dave had gone to extreme lengths to stay in her life. I couldn't believe how far he had taken it. Even more shocking, Dave hadn't told his family anything about the court case until it was over. He had kept it all secret, and now I was seeing the real depth of his obsession. I no longer have any contact with him, and I'm relieved for it. But that experience taught me an important lesson: trust your gut. Sometimes people you think you know have hidden sides that they keep from everyone around them. I hate to think what might have happened if his ex hadn't taken action and gotten that restraining order. Before I get into my story, I want to explain some background to help make sense of what happened. My grandmother passed away before I was born, so I never got the chance to meet her. Likewise, she never met me. To add to this, I had only been inside my grandparents' house once before an incident happened, which I'm about to share, and I barely remember it. I think I only used the restroom that one time. Now, on to the main story. When I was around 6 or 7 years old, I didn't have my own bedroom because my siblings occupied all the rooms, so I had to sleep in my parents' room on a separate bed. One night, while my parents were fast asleep, I was struggling to fall asleep myself. After tossing and turning, I decided to lie on my right side and just tried to relax. Time passed, and I opened my eyes to look around. Since I couldn't seem to fall asleep, that's when I saw her. Right in front of me stood a little girl, maybe around 5 or 6 years old. But she wasn't a normal little girl. She was completely translucent, almost like a gray shadow. Her eyes, or more like her eye sockets, were completely black, dark, and hollow. I remember every little detail about her appearance. Her hair was tied up in a ponytail at the top of her head, while the hair on the sides just hung loosely around her shoulders. She wore a short dress with some kind of pattern on it. Seeing something like this would terrify anyone, especially a young kid like I was. I was frozen in place, just staring at her. I don't even think I blinked for the entire time we locked eyes, which felt like an eternity, though it was probably just a minute or two. I was too scared to move or scream, so I tried to think of a way to make her disappear. For some reason, I thought that if I looked away, maybe she would leave. So I turned my head away from her. When I glanced back to check if she was still there, she was gone. I fell asleep shortly after that, but I didn't mention it to my parents the next morning. I knew they would have brushed it off as my imagination, but I swear I saw that little girl, and I can still remember her face clearly. That should have been the end of it. But years later, something even stranger happened. Fast forward to when I was 16. My grandfather had passed away, and after his funeral, my family went to my grandparents' house to clean it out. We needed to sort through things so we could sell the house and keep any meaningful items. I was in the house with my mom, sister, and aunt, cleaning out the rooms one by one. Everything was going smoothly until we made our way to the master bedroom, where my grandparents used to sleep. Not as soon as I entered the room and looked above the bed, I froze. Hanging on the wall was a painting of the exact same little girl I had seen in my parents' room all those years ago. It was her same hairstyle, same dress, same age. Everything about her matched perfectly. I freaked out. I tried to explain to my sister that I had seen this girl before, but she didn't seem to care or just didn't believe me. I couldn't understand how I could have imagined this girl years before, only to see her again in a painting I had never seen before in my life. It wasn't like I had grown up visiting my grandparents' house regularly. I had only been inside once before. How could I have possibly known about the painting? It left me wondering, what did my grandmother have to do with all of this? There's one more piece to this story. Ever since I was born, I've had a birthmark on my forehead. It starts at my hairline and runs down to the top of my nose. It's a bit redder than the rest of my skin. My mom once heard from someone that a birthmark like that is called an angel's kiss. She believes that after my grandmother passed away, she might have kissed me on the forehead as an angel before I was born, leaving that mark. After hearing that, I started to think, could it have been my grandmother who visited me that night? Maybe she came to check on me, but in the form of the little girl from the painting. But then again, I've always believed that when someone dies, they go to heaven or hell and stay there. I'm not sure if it's possible for spirits to come back to earth after death. I also lean toward believing that only angels and demons can cause paranormal events in the living world. So, what do you think? Was I visited by my grandmother, or could it have been an angel or something darker? When I was still married to my military husband, we faced a number of strange experiences that I can't forget to this day. At the time, he was stationed overseas, and I had moved with our two daughters to our next duty station. I rented this charming old house, over 100 years old, in a rural area with a massive yard that seemed like a dream for the kids. At first, I thought it was perfect. Everything was serene, quiet, and just what we needed. However, that peace came with a catch. The house had some mysterious happenings that slowly began to reveal themselves after we moved in. The first and most regular occurrence was something I came to call the knocker. It started innocently enough. The house had an old, dark, and damp basement that I used for laundry, where the washer, dryer, and deep freezer were kept. The only entrance to the basement was a door in the kitchen, right next to the back door. It wasn't a place I liked spending too much time in, and I never allow my daughters to go down there due to how dark and musty it was one day. Not long after we moved in, I was in the kitchen when I heard knocking. It seemed to be coming from the back door. Naturally, I assumed it was a neighbor, so I went to answer it. But as I got closer, I realized the sound wasn't coming from the back door. It was coming from the basement door. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. My daughters were in the living room, and there was no way anyone could be in the basement. I opened the basement door cautiously, only to find nothing. No one was there. That was only the beginning. The knocking on the basement door became a regular occurrence, happening at least once a week. Each time I'd check, and no one would be there. I asked the neighbors and even the owner of the house about it, but they all claimed they had no idea what I was talking about. No one had mentioned anything strange about the house before we moved in. Aside from the knocking, there were other eerie things happening too. I had a framed photo of my husband and me that I hung on the wall by the front door. Almost every morning, I'd wake up to find the picture either hanging upside down or laying on the floor, often in bizarre locations, like under a chair or the sofa. I'd put it back in place, thinking maybe it was just gravity or the house settling. But it happened so often it started to feel like something more than coincidence. Things reached a new level of strange when my parents came to visit one weekend. We were all sitting in the living room just chatting when we suddenly heard knocking again. This time it was louder than usual, and it seemed like it was definitely coming from the back door. My practical mother insisted on answering it. Not knowing about the knocker, I tried to stop her, telling her it was best to ignore it. But she thought I was being rude. She opened the door to find, just as I expected, no one there. Her face pale when she realized I wasn't exaggerating. Without a word, she grabbed her purse, marched to the front door, and as she left, she muttered, "Mel, I'll be in the car." She refused to stay another night and never visited us at that house again. But it wasn't just my mom who experienced these strange events. After my husband returned from overseas, we had some friends over one evening. We were sitting in the living room, laughing and catching up, when suddenly one of our guests, his name was Dave, stopped mid-conversation. He was staring wide-eyed at the wall near the front door. His face was drained of color. "Susan," he said quietly to his wife, "get the baby. It's time to go home." We all turned to look at what had terrified him, and what we saw was impossible to ignore. The photo of my husband and me was slowly turning upside down, as if some invisible hand was twisting it. We watched in stunned silence until the picture came to rest completely upside down. Dave and his family left immediately, and to this day, he refuses to talk about what he saw that night. Over time, it became clear that whatever was in the house did not like my husband. In fact, every time he upset me or the children, something bad happened to him. One time, after a particularly heated argument, he stormed out of the house and drove to the local Kmart. About 30 minutes later, he called me from the store, sounding shaken. On his way there, the rear driver's side wheel had come off the truck, causing him to wreck it. He was lucky he wasn't hurt, but the incident was enough to rattle him. Not after that, my husband started calling the entity Hardy. He believed it was attached to the house, but soon after, we discovered that it wasn't. When we moved to our next duty station, Hardy followed us. The strange occurrences continued, but only for a short while. They stopped completely when we divorced. I have never experienced anything like it since. To this day, I have no explanation for what happened in that house or what Hardy truly was. All I know is that it left when my marriage ended, as if it was somehow tied to the tension in our relationship. A few years ago, I had just gotten home from work and decided to swipe through Tinder for a Friday night date. It was around 7 p.m., and I matched with a girl whose profile hinted at her love for smoking weed. So naturally, I started a conversation with her about that. Within a few minutes, she mentioned how much she wanted to smoke that night but didn't have any. Since she lived close by, just about 3 kilometers from my place, I suggested we meet up for some snacks, beers, and later smoke in my car. She agreed, sent me her WhatsApp number and location, and I got ready for the night. After showering and getting dressed, I jumped in my car, put her location into the GPS, and headed toward her. It took me a while to spot her on the street, but eventually I found her standing with a friend on the sidewalk. I honked, she recognized me, and got in the car. From the moment she sat down, something felt off. I tried to start a conversation, but she barely responded. It was as if I was talking to myself. She would occasionally say okay or just nod. I figured maybe she was shy and didn't think much of it. I took her to a snack bar where we grabbed something to eat and had a couple of beers. The whole time, she stayed completely silent, not offering more than a word or two. I finally gave up trying to talk, and we ate in awkward silence. Afterward, I suggested we smoke a joint in my car, and she agreed. We drove to a quiet, deserted street, parked, and moved to the back seat to light up. I thought maybe the weed would loosen her up and make her talk more, but even after a few puffs, she remained quiet. She did seem more relaxed, though, and eventually we started kissing, which led to having sex in the car. But this is where things took a strange turn. As we were getting intimate, her behavior started to freak me out. She suddenly grabbed my head with both hands, stared directly into my eyes with this intense, almost angry expression. Her eyes were wide open, and her mouth had a strange, unsettling smile. It was like she was someone else. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe she was just really high, but it definitely spooked me. After we finished, I dropped her off at the same spot I had picked her up from and went home the next day. When I was sober, I kept thinking about that strange, angry look she gave me in the car. It felt like more than just being high. Curious, I decided to check out her social media accounts to learn more about her. That's when things got even weirder. Her Instagram and Facebook pages were filled with random and bizarre posts. She had photos of cardboard sheets with weird phrases written in broken English. Stuff like, I love where you art our God. U.S. kill him. Where will us? We continue. Each sheet was covered with nonsensical sentences like that. One day, she started sharing a lot of personal information on her Instagram stories. She talked about having a baby she loved, being happy to reconnect with her grandmother, who had already passed away, and how she was getting back into Umbanda, an African-based religion that's common in Brazil. Then, she said something that made everything click. She mentioned that whenever she got high, she felt like she was possessed by the spirit of her grandmother and that she actually enjoyed it. That's when I realized what might have been going on that night. It hit me that she was probably under the influence of her grandmother's spirit when we met. Her social media posts started to get even creepier. She uploaded pictures of herself that looked almost demonic, like she was possessed. In one picture, her jaw looked unnaturally wide, as if it was broken, and her eyes were rolled back, completely white. The image sent chills down my spine. It reminded me of something you'd see in a horror movie. After seeing all of that, I decided to cut all ties. I unfollowed her on social media and blocked her number. Whether she was truly possessed or just inventing the whole story, I wasn't interested in finding out. It was an experience I'd rather not repeat. My name is Bauman, and I'm 20 years old, from a small village nestled in the mountains of northern Iran. It's a quiet, secluded place surrounded by vast forests that stretch as far as the eye can see. I've lived here my whole life, so the woods have always been a part of my daily routine. But 2 years ago, when I was 18, I had an encounter that left me shaken to my core, and even today I still get chills thinking about it. It was a partly cloudy day in 2021. Like most afternoons, I decided to go for a walk in the forest behind our house. The main path starts right near our backyard, so it wasn't like I had to travel far to get into the woods. The road was a simple dirt trail surrounded by towering trees, and I knew it well enough not to worry. Even though it was getting late, it was around 5:30 or 6 p.m., and though it was starting to get dark, I figured I'd be back before nightfall. I had been walking for about 20 minutes when I reached a part of the path that was completely straight, stretching out about 1,000 feet ahead. You could somewhat see the end of it, and as I was walking, I noticed something. There, at the far end of the road, stood a dark figure. It was hard to make out exactly what it was in the fading light, just a black shape, and moving in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it might be a cow. In our village, it's common for people to let their cows roam the woods, but they usually stick together in large groups. This one, however, was alone, and stranger still, it wasn't moving at all. That's when I began to feel uneasy. But for reasons I can't explain, I kept walking toward it. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe I didn't want to seem scared in case it was just someone playing a prank. My heart was pounding in my chest, but I couldn't stop myself from approaching. What struck me as odd, though, was that the figure still hadn't moved, not even an inch. As I got closer, I started to make out its shape more clearly. It was tall, much taller than a person, and had long, skinny legs. At one point, I even thought I saw a third leg or maybe a stick in its hand, but everything was still so blurry in the dim light. The closer I got, the more terrified I became, but I just couldn't look away. My heart felt like it was going to explode. Finally, I stopped about 60 feet away from the figure. We stood there in silence, me staring at it. And it just stood there, still as a statue. My body was frozen in fear, and I didn't have the courage to say a word. After what felt like an eternity, I made the decision to turn around and walk away. As I walked back, I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting the figure to move or follow me, but every time I glanced back, it was still there, standing motionless. It wasn't until I took a few more turns along the path that I finally lost sight of it, and I started to calm down a little. The fear wasn't completely gone, but I felt relieved that it was behind me. I tried to distract myself by pulling out my phone and calling a friend. Just talking to someone would help, I thought. But then, for some reason, I made the mistake of looking back one last time. What I saw has haunted me ever since. There, standing in the middle of the road about 50 feet behind me, was the same dark figure. It hadn't moved before, but now it was much closer, and it was watching me. My blood ran cold. This time I didn't wait to see if it would move. I bolted. I ran faster than I ever have in my life, not daring to look back. I sprinted all the way home, my heart pounding, my legs trembling. When I finally burst through the door, my hands and feet were shaking uncontrollably. I had never been so scared in my life. My family could see the fear in my eyes, and when I told them what happened, they tried to convince me that I was just hallucinating. But I knew what I had seen, and by the look in their eyes, I think they knew it too. For days after, I couldn't shake the memory of that figure. I didn't tell anyone else about it for a long time, but the image of that dark shape standing in the road still haunts me. A few months ago, I started doing some research on local legends and myths. That's when I found something that sent chills down my spine. There's a creature known in the forest of Mazandaran, where I live, called the Deb. It's said to be tall and dark, with a huge body. People claim it lives in the woods and attacks those who wander out alone at night or dawn. Those who survive the Deb are often left confused or unable to speak. Reading that description brought everything back, and I wondered if what I saw that night could have been the Deb. It's something I'll never know for sure, but the thought still terrifies me. My biggest regret is that I didn't take a picture or record a video when I was walking toward it. But in that moment, fear had taken over, and all I could think about was getting away. To this day, I still get scared just thinking about it, and I hope I never encounter anything like that again. This story takes place when I was around 10 or 11, living in a small apartment building in downtown Reno. The apartment wasn't anything special, just a simple layout with a living room connected to a small kitchen and a separate bathroom. My family and I had experienced some strange things while living there, but this particular incident stayed with me for years. It was one of those moments that makes you question what is real and what is not. One evening, I found myself home alone. My family had gone out to dinner, leaving me behind as punishment for causing trouble earlier in the day. I was still in a bit of a mood, but eventually I got hungry and decided to go into the kitchen for a snack. As I made my way to the fridge, something immediately struck me as odd. The bathroom door was wide open. Normally, we kept it closed because it didn't always smell the best in there, so seeing it open was unusual. I hesitated for a moment, then decided to investigate. After a quick check, I figured one of my siblings had probably left it open before heading out, so I closed it and moved on. About 15 minutes later, I had to use the restroom. I've had bladder issues for as long as I can remember, so this wasn't out of the ordinary. I walked through the kitchen, and as I passed by the kitchen mirror, I glanced at myself and sort of gave myself a nod. I was really into my appearance back then, always thinking I was some sort of hotshot. You know how it is at that age, everything is a big deal, especially how you look. Feeling satisfied with what I saw, I went into the bathroom to do my business. After finishing up, I naturally turned to the bathroom mirror to give myself another once-over. That's when things took a bizarre and unsettling turn. The reflection staring back at me wasn't me. Sure, it looked like me at first glance, but something about it was entirely off. It didn't move the way I did or even seem to mimic my expressions. In fact, the reflection stood perfectly still while I moved, and when it did move, it was delayed and in a way that didn't make sense. I stared at it, frozen, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. My reflection's eyes seemed darker, almost hollow, and it didn't smile like I would. Its mouth twitched unnervingly, and as I prepared to leave the bathroom, that's when it smiled. But it wasn't my smile. It was something twisted, sinister. Imagine a mix of the Joker from DC Comics and Huggy Wuggy. That's the kind of smile it had, something evil and inhuman that chilled me to the bone. Panic set in. My heart raced, and I bolted out of the bathroom, vowing to never look into that mirror again. The thought of seeing that twisted version of myself lingered in my mind for days. I couldn't shake the fear that it would happen again, and I avoided that bathroom mirror as much as possible. A few months passed, and I was still creeped out by what I had seen. Then, one day, the bathroom mirror broke, seemingly on its own. No one was in there, and nothing hit it just shattered. We had to remove it after that, and it was never replaced. After the mirror was gone, the weirdness stopped. There were no more creepy reflections, no more unsettling moments in the bathroom. Whatever had been attached to that mirror left with it. I am still not sure what exactly happened that day, but I've never experienced anything quite like it since. It was like something from a nightmare, and to this day I don't like looking into mirrors for too long, especially when I am alone. You never know what might be staring back at you. I thought I would share this experience with you because it has stayed with me for years. It happened when I was in middle school, and to this day I am not sure what I encountered. Let me give you some background first. I grew up as an only child, living with my dad. My dad had to go to work very early in the morning, so on school days he would drop me off at my grandma's house at around 5 a.m. It became our routine. I'd go inside, head straight to her bedroom, and get a little more sleep before I had to wake up for school. My grandma's house was a simple, one-story home. Nothing fancy about it at all, just an average house like many others in the neighborhood. But despite its ordinary appearance, something always felt off. There was this strange, unsettling energy in the house. Over the years, I experienced a few odd occurrences that only deepened my sense of unease. Sometimes I would hear strange noises, like the bathroom door being open 1 minute and then slamming shut with no explanation. My relatives even mentioned things they had seen while passing by rooms in the house, like my uncle once swore he saw the dark shadow of a man sitting at the edge of the bed in one of the guest rooms. I never saw this shadow figure myself, but I had heard enough stories about him that I knew something wasn't quite right in the house. Maybe it was this figure, or maybe it was something else entirely. But one particular encounter still sends chills down my spine whenever I think about it. As usual, it was a school day, and my dad dropped me off at my grandma's house just before 5 a.m. It was still dark outside, and the house was quiet. I let myself in, as I always did, and went straight to her room. She was still asleep, and I was careful not to wake her as I tiptoed over to the bed. My grandma's bed was small, a modest single bed pushed up against the wall. Every morning, when I stayed over, I would lie down at the opposite end of the bed from her with my head by her feet. I climbed in and pulled the blanket over me, closing my eyes, hoping to catch another hour of sleep before it was time to get ready for school. Not even a full minute had passed when I heard the door to the bedroom creak open. My heart sank instantly. I hadn't heard anyone else come into the house, and my grandma was still asleep. Who could it be? Before I could even process what was happening, I heard footsteps, quick, deliberate footsteps moving toward the bed. They weren't the slow, shuffling footsteps of my grandma. They were faster, more intentional, like someone who knew exactly where they were going. The footsteps stopped suddenly, right next to the bed where I was lying, and then I felt it, a presence. Someone or something was standing over me, watching me. I didn't need to open my eyes to know that it was there, looming right beside me. The weight of its gaze was suffocating. It was as if it had locked its attention on me completely, and I could feel that stare pierce through me. The sensation was so intense that I froze. Every instinct in my body told me not to move, not to open my eyes, not to acknowledge whatever it was that had come into the room. I held the blanket tightly, trying to stop myself from shaking. My heart was pounding so hard that I could hear it in my ears. Whoever or whatever was there remained still, staring at me for what felt like an eternity. The air around me was thick with fear, and I felt as though I couldn't breathe. It was a terror I had never experienced before, the kind that paralyzes you completely. I knew, deep in my gut, that I couldn't turn around. I couldn't look at it. I didn't want to know what was standing beside me. The minutes crawled by, but I stayed as still as I could, my eyes clenched tightly shut, hoping that whatever was there would leave me alone. Then, finally, after what felt like hours, I heard the footsteps again. They moved away from the bed just as quickly as they had approached, and the door quietly closed behind them. I didn't move. I didn't dare move. I waited, straining to listen for any more sounds, but the house was silent once again. My grandma was still fast asleep at the other end of the bed, completely unaware of what had just happened. Eventually, when I was sure that the presence had left, I opened my eyes. The room looked the same as it always did, but the atmosphere felt different, like something had just passed through it. I didn't tell my grandma what had happened. I couldn't explain it, and I wasn't sure if she would believe me. But I knew that I would never forget the feeling of that stare, that oppressive presence that had stood so close to me that morning. Even now I wonder what would have happened if I had turned around, if I had dared to look at what was standing by the bed. But I'm glad I didn't. Whatever it was, I don't think I was meant to see it. And to this day, I'm thankful that I never did. This is a true story from when I was just 11 years old, though I've turned it into something more haunting than I could have imagined at the time. To this day, I'm not sure if what I experienced was real or if fear had distorted reality, but I can still feel the terror that gripped me that night. It was an ordinary evening, one of those cool nights where the sun had just dipped below the horizon, leaving a soft glow in the sky. My best friend lived about 10 minutes down the hill from my house, and after a day full of laughter and playing games, we'd finished off the night by doing what every group of mischievous kids did, playing ding-dong, itch around the neighborhood. The thrill of ringing a stranger's doorbell and running as fast as you could before getting caught was the perfect way to wrap up the day. The game had gone smoothly without any close calls, but eventually it was time to head home. The walk up that hill was a familiar one, a straight shot from my friend's house to mine. What I didn't know was that tonight would change how I felt about that walk forever. As I made my way up the hill, the world around me seemed quieter than usual. The air was still, with only the occasional rustle of leaves. My feet scuffed against the pavement, and my heart was still racing from the earlier excitement of our game. But as I moved further along, something broke through the silence. Footsteps. At first, they were distant, barely noticeable, but they didn't match my own. I paused, the sound fading as soon as I stopped. My pulse quickened. Maybe it was just someone out for a late-night stroll, I thought. People in the neighborhood often walked their dogs or took evening jogs, so I shook it off and continued. But the footsteps started again, this time closer. I glanced back over my shoulder, and that's when I saw him. A tall, shadowy figure stood a good distance behind me, but close enough for me to make out his shape. He was bulky, like someone who spent his days doing hard labor. In his hand he carried what looked like a wrench, heavy, gleaming slightly under the street lights. My first instinct was to rationalize it. It's probably just a construction worker, I told myself, though there was no construction nearby, and certainly no reason for him to be out at this hour. But even as I tried to calm myself, a deep, gut-wrenching feeling settled in my stomach. Something was wrong. I sped up, walking faster than before, my feet moving as if on autopilot. The man's footsteps matched mine, gaining speed. I didn't need to look back to know that he was following me. My heart hammered in my chest as panic started to take hold. I reached the top of the hill, panting lightly, and dared to look over my shoulder again. That's when I saw his face, or rather, what little I could make out of it. His expression wasn't one of anger, but something far more unsettling. It was cold, predatory, like he wasn't just following me ... He was hunting me ... Any hope I had of convincing myself this was a harmless situation disappeared in that moment. Without thinking, I broke into a full sprint. The pounding of my sneakers against the pavement was drowned out by the heavy thuds of his boots as he chased me, each step echoing louder in my ears. I ran harder than I ever had before, fear driving me forward, my breath coming in ragged gasps. There was only one thought in my mind: get away. As I turned a corner, I spotted a narrow alley between two houses. I didn't think, I just dove into it, scrambling into a dark window well hidden in the shadows. My back pressed against the cold brick, my knees pulled tight to my chest. I tried to make myself as small as possible. The world felt eerily quiet again, save for the frantic beating of my heart. I peeked up from my hiding spot, barely daring to breathe. That's when I saw him again. He was standing at the top of the hill, scanning the area, as if he knew I was close. His hand gripped the wrench tightly, tapping it against his palm with slow, deliberate motions, as if he were savoring the thought of catching me. My stomach twisted with terror. He knew I was nearby. But, thankfully, he hadn't found me yet. I could only hope he'd move on and leave me alone. Minutes dragged by like hours. My muscles ached from holding myself so tightly in that cramped space, but I didn't dare move. I watched him as he wandered down the street, looking around, occasionally stopping to survey the area. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he continued down the street, the sound of his boots gradually fading away. But I wasn't relieved. Not yet. I waited, counting the seconds, straining to hear any hint that he was still out there. When I was certain the coast was clear, I slowly pulled myself out of the window, my legs trembling beneath me. I glanced in every direction, scanning the shadows for any sign of him. My house was just down the road. It felt so far away, but I knew I couldn't wait any longer. I had to go, and I had to go fast. Taking a deep breath, I broke into a sprint once again. My house was within sight, but the fear that the man could leap out at any moment kept me on edge. Every shadow seemed to move. Every rustle of the wind sounded like his footsteps. I reached my front door, nearly tripping over the porch steps in my haste. My hands fumbled with the lock as I glanced nervously over my shoulder, certain that any second he would appear again. Finally, the door gave way, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut behind me. I locked it with trembling fingers, my body still shaking from the adrenaline. I was safe. For now, but for nights after that, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The sound of footsteps on pavement, or even my own shadow under a street lamp, would send my heart racing. I never saw the man again, but in the back of my mind I knew he was still out there somewhere, a silent threat lurking in the dark, waiting, watching, always just a few steps behind. When we first moved from South Africa to Australia, it was a time of great excitement and adjustment. Everything was new: the culture, the surroundings, and the house we moved into. It was a beautiful home in a quiet, picturesque neighborhood, with the back of the house facing a dense forest and a golf course beyond. The view from the back during the day was serene, the perfect setting for anyone who enjoyed nature. However, as night fell, the forest took on a much darker, almost ominous presence, especially when the moonlight didn't fully penetrate the thick canopy of trees. But none of that concerned me too much at first. What really bothered me was the light from the street lamp right outside my bedroom window. My room faced the street, and the glow from that street lamp was relentless. It pierced through even the thickest curtains, creating an odd, unsettling glow that filled the room every night. It was a constant irritation for someone like me who preferred total darkness to sleep. I could never quite fully rest with that pale, unnatural light seeping into the room. Still, I managed to get by most nights, learning to live with the glow as best I could. But one night, everything changed. I woke up in the middle of the night, my eyes instantly drawn to the familiar glow from the window. At first, I was frustrated, thinking that once again the street lamp had disturbed my sleep. I squinted at the light, ready to turn over and attempt to block it out, when something caught my eye. Just to the left of the window, in the corner of the room where the light didn't fully reach, I noticed a dark figure standing there. My heart froze in my chest. I blinked, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The figure stood eerily still, and as my eyes adjusted to the shadows, I could make out more details. It wasn't just any figure. It was a girl, her long, jet black hair hanging down, obscuring most of her face, and her body was cloaked in a white dress. She looked exactly like the girl from The Grudge. I immediately sat up in bed, my mind racing between disbelief and terror. The moment I moved, the girl vanished. For a second I was paralyzed, my heart pounding in my ears. I tried to convince myself that it had been a dream, a trick of the light combined with my tired, overactive imagination. But despite my rational thoughts, I couldn't shake the lingering fear. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chest, trying to calm myself. Just as I was beginning to settle, I heard an unmistakable, low growling sound coming from the direction of the door. My eyes snapped open, and this time I was fully awake. The growling wasn't faint. It was right next to me, near the foot of the bed, coming from the door that led out into the hallway. The sound was guttural, animalistic, and completely out of place in our quiet suburban home. I sat up again, this time filled with a fear so intense I could barely breathe. This was no dream. Something was in my room, something that was watching me, growling at me from the shadows. My mind raced, trying to find an explanation, but none of it made sense. The girl had vanished, but now this sound, this menacing presence filled the room. I didn't know what else to do. My instinct told me to run, but I felt frozen in place. In a desperate attempt to calm myself, I did the only thing that came to mind. Out loud, in the darkness of my room, I prayed for protection. My voice shook as I whispered the words, but with each word I felt a strange sense of calm begin to settle over me. The growling stopped. I waited for what felt like an eternity, listening to the silence, my heart still pounding in my chest. I didn't dare move for a long time, afraid that whatever had made that noise would return. But after what felt like hours, I finally lay back down, pulling the covers tightly round me. For the rest of the night, nothing happened. The eerie presence was gone, and the room fell into a deep, unsettling silence. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that maybe it had all been a dream, that maybe my mind had played tricks on me in the middle of the night. But deep down, I knew what I had experienced was real. A few months later, the mirror in my room, the same mirror I had glanced at every night before going to bed, broke. It wasn't cracked or chipped, it shattered, seemingly of its own accord, as if the presence in my room had somehow caused it. We had to remove it, and after that the strange occurrences stopped. I never experienced anything like that again, but to this day I still think back to that night. The image of that girl, the sound of the growling, and the overwhelming feeling of being watched have never fully left me. Even now, as an adult, I prefer to sleep in complete darkness, always keeping an eye on the shadows, just in case something is watching from the corner of the room. It may not be the scariest story to some, but for me, it's a memory I'll never forget. Living in a historic part of upstate New York, you get used to the whispers about abandoned buildings, spooky forests, and eerie cemeteries. For those of us who grew up here, exploring these places was almost a rite of passage. My hometown has 2 major cemeteries that every kid has snuck into at some point, but there's one that stands out, an infamous graveyard with a reputation for attracting cults, occultists, and all sorts of dark energy. The place is so notorious that if the police catch you there, you're slapped with a felony trespassing charge. Rumors about this cemetery are endless: ghosts, demons, mental patients from the 1920s who supposedly still wander the hills. Some even claim that Satan himself hangs out there just to scare off curious townies. The cemetery is located deep in the woods, about 1.5 miles down a gravel road. The walk alone is enough to make your skin crawl, passing crumbled mausoleums where wannabe witches and Satanists light candles and leave behind eerie symbols. This was all back in 2009. I was fascinated by the legends surrounding the place and decided I had to see it for myself. I convinced my girlfriend, Lindsay, and a few friends to join me on a Saturday night adventure. The plan was simple: park in a nearby neighborhood, sneak through the woods, and avoid the gates by cutting through the trees. The night before our trip, I was at a party with my buddy Kevin. As I enthusiastically laid out my plans, I noticed his expression change from interest to concern. Finally, he spoke up, telling me about an experience he had nearly 10 years prior. Kevin and some friends had gone into the cemetery to drink, get high, and party. They made it to the center of the overgrown graveyard, built a fire, and started having a good time. But as the night wore on, Kevin and another guy passed out. They were jolted awake to find men in hooded cloaks looming over them, knives poised at their throats. Kevin's instincts kicked in. He kicked one of the guys, grabbed the knife hilt made of animal bone, and shoved another attacker into the brush. Then he dragged his friend to his feet, and they ran like hell toward the road. As they sprinted, at least 6 other cloaked figures chased them. Just as they reached the road, a state trooper happened to drive by. Kevin and his buddy surrendered themselves to the cop, who revealed that law enforcement had been tracking a cult that had claimed several victims in that very cemetery. The cop told them something that stuck with Kevin. If you ever find yourself in the woods and hear animal noises that don't sound quite right, leave immediately. It's people trying not to tip you off. Kevin's story sent a chill down my spine, but I shrug it off. That was 1999, I thought. There's no way a cult is still living out there in 2009. Plus, I figured we'd be safe there were 4 of us, and we'd be careful. Armed with both friends and confidence, I decided to move forward with the plan. Saturday night came, and we made our way to the cemetery. My girlfriend, Lindsay, and her friend Sarah were in the middle of our group, while my buddy John and I took the lead. 2 others brought up the rear. The walk along the gravel road was unsettling. Shadows darted between the trees, and we kept catching glimpses of something moving just out of sight. I wasn't sure if it was real or my imagination, but it didn't matter. We were determined. Then we heard it. A loud whistle pierced the air, coming from deep within the woods on our right. Another whistle answered from the left. As we continued, whistles echoed ahead and behind us, forming an eerie pattern, like a bird call, but not quite right. It reminded me of what Kevin had told me. My heart dropped. John was starting to get antsy. asking how much farther we had to go. I told him those whistles weren't coming from animals, and they weren't ghosts. They were people who didn't want us there. He didn't believe me at first and pushed ahead, but as we moved forward, the whistles got louder, closer. We were being surrounded. John's bravado faded fast when he saw a figure in a hood up ahead. He quickly turned back to the group. "I think we need to leave." "Nah," he said. There was no argument from the rest of us. We began jogging back toward the road, trying to be quiet but fast. My mind raced with the stories Kevin had told me. I didn't want to find out what would happen if we didn't get out. We reached the road, still hearing faint whistles behind us, but no longer seeing the figures. As we walked back to the car, my legs felt like jelly. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by the cold reality of how close we had come to something far worse than ghost stories. In the end, the best advice I received wasn't from my research, but from Kevin. His warning about those whistles probably saved our lives that night. We never found out who or what was in those woods, but I'm certain that if we hadn't turned back when we did, we might not have made it out at all. It was around 3 a.m., the hour when silence seems to stretch, and every sound feels amplified. I was in my apartment, a creaky old building that groaned with the changing weather. As usual, I was wide awake, scrolling through my phone to pass the time. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, until I heard a faint whisper coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I froze, straining to listen, but all I heard was the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the floorboards. Convincing myself it was just the building settling, I brushed it off and went back to my phone. A minute later, the whisper came again, louder this time. It was as if someone was standing just outside my bedroom door, their voice trembling and pleading. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a chill down my spine. I sat up in bed, my heart racing, listening closely, but the whisper stopped. Silence hung in the air. It must be a neighbor, I thought. In an old building like this, sound travels easily through the walls, but this didn't feel distant. It felt like it was in my hallway, right outside the door. I crept out of bed, moving cautiously toward the door. Pressing my ear against the wood, I held my breath, listening for any sign of life. Nothing. The hallway was as quiet as a grave. After a few minutes, I convinced myself I was being paranoid, just tired and jumpy from being up too late. I turned to go back to bed, but then I heard it again. This time the whisper was unmistakable. "Please, ... let me in." I froze, fear gripping me like a vice. My hand hovered over the door handle. I don't know what came over me, but without thinking, I yanked the door open. The hallway was empty. I stood there, stunned, staring into the dimly lit corridor. The light flickered above, casting eerie shadows on the walls. A cold draft slipped through the window at the far end of the hall, but there was no one there. I slammed the door shut, locking it tightly, my hands trembling. I backed away, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open. That night I didn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear the whisper again, just outside the door, pleading, desperate. It followed me over the next few days, growing more insistent. I heard it everywhere, in the kitchen, the bathroom, even the living room. But no matter where I was, it always seemed to come from just beyond the door or around the corner, always out of sight. Please, ... let me in. I tried everything to drown it out, music, the TV, even blasting white noise, but nothing worked. The whisper cut through it all, relentless. It was always there, lurking, waiting. One night, after nearly a week of sleepless nights, I couldn't take it anymore. Exhausted, terrified, I sat on the floor in front of my door, tears streaming down my face. In a moment of desperation, I whispered back, "What do you want?" For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Then the whisper returned, clearer than ever. "I just want to come home." My heart pounded in my chest. The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. I had no idea what to say, but I managed to ask, "Who are you?" The voice was soft, almost lost in the quiet. "I used to live here." A chill ran down my spine. I'd lived in the apartment for years, and had never heard anything about it being haunted. But the fear in the voice was palpable, real. "Why why can't you come in?" I asked, my voice shaking. The pause that followed was unbearable. Finally, the whisper returned, so faint I almost didn't catch it. "I'm trapped, I need you to let me in." Panic surged through me. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the apartment, and never look back. But something held me there, rooted to the spot. I wanted to help, but fear kept me frozen in place. The whisper came again, pleading, desperate, "Please, let me in." My hand hovered over the lock, heart racing. I took a deep breath and reached out to unlock the door. Just as my fingers brushed the cold metal, the whisper stopped. Everything went silent. I stood there, waiting, but the whisper didn't return. The apartment was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I didn't sleep that night, too afraid to close my eyes, too terrified to stay. I moved out the next day. Since then, I haven't heard the whisper, not in my new place, at least. But sometimes, late at night, I think I catch the faintest sound just a breath away, asking once again to be let in. The boy smirked, his ghostly form leaning against the doorframe as if he was completely at ease with his bizarre situation. "You sure about that?" "'Cause you look a little spooked." I forced myself to stand up straight and tried to act normal, but my knees were shaky and my palms were clammy. "I'm just processing," I reply, keeping my voice as steady as possible. "I mean, it's not every day someone finds out they're sharing a house with a ghost." He shrugged, completely unbothered by the revelation. "Well, now you know. So what are you going to do about it?" I blinked at him, unsure of how to answer. "Do about it? What do you mean, you know? Like, are you going to try to get rid of me or something? Call in a priest, throw some sage around," he snorted. Good luck with that. The truth was I hadn't thought that far ahead. "I mean, what does one do when they find out their new house comes with a dead teenager?" Part of me wanted to flee, to just pack up my neatly labeled jars and run out the front door. But another part of me, an admittedly strange part, was curious. I had a ghost in my house, a real ghost. That wasn't something you encountered every day. Why would I want to get rid of you? I asked, surprising myself with the question. "You're not, like, haunting me or anything, right? You're not trying to scare me?" The boy gave me a sideways glance, his smirk fading slightly. "Nah, if I wanted to scare you, you'd know it by now. I just exist here. This is where I'm stuck." That piqued my curiosity even more. "Stuck? You mean you can't leave?" He nodded, crossing his arms over his chest. "Yeah, I've been stuck in this house for, like, I dunno, forever. No idea why or how. I just woke up one day and boom, ghost." I stared at him, trying to wrap my head around it. "So what do you do all day? I mean, if you're just here, are you bored? Do you get bored?" He gave a hollow laugh. "Bored out of my mind. That's why I chuck soap at the walls or mess with people who move in. It's not exactly fun being invisible and dead, you know." I frowned. "Has anyone else ever seen you before? Like, other people who've lived here?" He shook his head. "Nope, you're the first." That stopped me in my tracks. "Wait, I'm the first person who's been able to see you." "Yup," he replied, popping the P for emphasis. "Everyone else just goes on living their lives, and I just do my thing, throwing stuff, making noises, hoping someone will notice. But they never do until you." I didn't know what to say. Was it a compliment, a curse? I glanced around the room, suddenly feeling like the walls were closing in. This ghost, this teenager, had been haunting this house for who knows how long, completely unnoticed, until I came along. I cleared my throat, trying to break the awkward silence. "So ... what now? You're just gonna hang around and ... watch me stack jars?" The boy shrugged again, though his expression softened slightly. "I dunno. I've never had someone to talk to before. It's kind of nice not being ignored for once." I felt a pang of sympathy for him. Ghost or not, he seemed lonely, just a kid stuck in a limbo that he didn't understand. And somehow I was the one who could see him, who could talk to him. "Well," I said slowly, "I guess you can stay, as long as you don't, like, try to haunt me or something." He chuckled, his smirk returning. "Deal. But you should know, I'm not exactly house-trained. I might still throw a soap bar or two when I get bored." I rolled my eyes, though a small smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. "Just ... try not to hit me in the head again." "Okay. No promises," he replied, grinning. As the reality of the situation settled in, I realized that my new life in this house was going to be anything but ordinary. Between dodging soap projectiles and living with a snarky ghost, I had a feeling things were about to get a lot more interesting. Days passed, and the boy who eventually introduced himself as Kyle became a constant presence in my life. At first I thought having a ghost around would be terrifying, but after a while it became ... normal. Well, as normal as living with a ghost can be. Kyle wasn't evil or malicious, just bored and sarcastic. He'd float around the house, occasionally knocking things over or rearranging my perfectly organized pantry just to mess with me. But mostly he just talked. He told me stories about when he was alive, though he didn't remember much about how he died. His memories were fuzzy, like a half-forgotten dream. "I think I was in a car accident," he said one evening while lounging on the couch, his translucent form flickering slightly in the dim light. "But I can't remember for sure. It's all a blur." I listened, fascinated by his story, but also saddened by it. He was just a kid. His life had been cut short, and now he was stuck here, in this house, with no way to move on. "Have you ever tried to, find out why you're still here?" I asked, not sure how to approach the subject. "Like maybe there's something you need to do before you can ... move on." Kyle sighed, his eyes flickering with a strange mix of frustration and sadness. "Yeah, I've thought about it, but it's not like there's a handbook for ghosts, I don't even know where to start." I frowned, feeling a sudden determination rise within me. "Well, maybe we can figure it out. I mean, if you're stuck here for a reason, there's got to be something we can do to help you move on, right?" Kyle looked at me, his expression unreadable. "You'd really help me with that." I nodded. "Of course. I mean, you're kind of stuck with me, and I'm stuck with you. Might as well figure this thing out together." For the first time since I'd met him, Kyle's sarcastic smirk faded, replaced by something softer, almost vulnerable. "Thanks," he muttered, looking away as if he didn't want me to see how much it meant to him. And so we started trying to figure out the mystery of Kyle's unfinished business. It wasn't easy. There were no clear answers, no signs pointing us in the right direction, but we worked together, piecing together fragments of his past searching for any clues that might explain why he was still here. As the days turned into weeks, I found myself growing strangely attached to my ghostly roommate. Kyle was a reminder that life was unpredictable, that things didn't always make sense. But he also reminded me that even in the strangest of circumstances, you could find connection, even friendship, and maybe, just maybe, we'd find a way to help him move on.